for his command as they flew closer and closer. But Burr misunderstood at that very second and started attacking that giant. At this time, Iris, who was on the dragon Kaisel, climbed even higher and started using his sword. He struck the giant with a large lightning bolt, but it deflected in time. At the same second, Jinwoo sprang into action and jumped off of Kaisel straight at the giant. But Igris continued to act anyway. Apparently not liking the fact that he dodged after his first and second attacks. He jumped straight at him, and while that giant started swinging his sword, Igris was already on his body. The giant noticed that he was getting closer to him and started to attack him again with that big lightning bolt that hit his face, but he managed to block it with his big hand. But at that time, Jinwoo appeared and struck him in the eye, causing that monster to start screaming. Jinwoo realized that he was right after all, protecting only his face. At this time, Bear began to divert the giant's attention to himself, and Jinwoo began to use the monarch's power, growing stronger and lighting up with violently bright colors. And in that same second, he started to launch many attacks on the face of that big giant Jinho, who was standing hunter, and observing that it didn't look like a battle between a hunter and a monster, but rather a battle between two monsters. After all, Jinwoo attacked him with very great strength and speed, to which that giant could not reply anything. He was just agonizing in pain. Jinwoo, who was standing and ready to strike with his Chaos Blade, at that very second, struck with such a force that it destroyed the giant's right eye. At that same second, Jinwoo started shouting for Bear to spring into action, and Bear flew up with great speed, hitting that giant right in the eye. In response, the giant raised his hands up and shouted frantically, for this was something he could never have imagined. At the same moment, the Chaos Blade skill was applied, and as soon as Jinwoo started to use it, he and his general struck their final blows. As a result, the huge giant began to fall to the ground and was eventually defeated. As soon as the enemy was defeated, Jinwoo's level instantly increased, and he stood on the building, starting to reflect on the fact that the enemy had been damaged. At this moment, Jinho ran up and started congratulating Jinwoo for being so awesome and defeating the giant boss. But Jinwoo thought about the fact that the message didn't say that the dungeon boss had been defeated. He realized that this raid wasn't over yet, and the black aura wasn't gone yet, and he couldn't extract the shadow of the garden giants. And as soon as Jinho started to approach Jinwoo, he stopped him. After all, he realized that the danger was still not over, and danger could come at any moment. But suddenly, General Bear began to appear from the giant's body, and tell Jinwoo that it was him, but Jinwoo, even so, realized that Bear was already dead, and his magic was very difficult to sense at this moment. The gate that was in front of them began to act strangely somehow, and an incredible wave of magic began to be released. Suddenly, Jinwoo remembered what was near him, but as soon as he turned around, he saw Igris had covered him with his shadow, and in that very second, the gate sucked in magic. Jinwoo had never seen such a thing before. He ordered Jinho to stay where he was, and he himself would go and check the situation outside the gate. Jinwoo jumped into the gate and suddenly found himself on the other side. His brother was standing there, and he realized that they were in some strange place, a castle. Looking around, Jinwoo noticed that it was very spacious and realized that this place was perfect for giants. His BR, presumably a weapon, that was with him spoke up, asking if he could hear a voice coming from the other end of the hallway. It was a strange laugh, and Jinwoo couldn't understand why he had enemies in this dungeon. But it was funny to him, and he obviously had a good sense of humor. At this moment, he decided to move on, but at the end of the corridor, there was a huge giant waiting for him who was laughing with such force that his stomach must be hurting. He started talking about the prophecies of the rulers and the one who had appeared to him to wish him well and find out how he was doing. But Jinwoo looked at him and did not realize who it could be. But that giant began to tell him to release him from his chains, for he knew the plans of the monarchs, and it was urgent to tell the other rulers. But as soon as the giant raised his head, he started to get angry as he saw the stranger. Jinwoo started asking who they were talking about, calling them monarchs or whatever. They did this to him, and the giant began to reply that they were the ones they were using as the cornerstone in the actual war. Jinwoo had tried to dialogue with the monsters earlier, but none of them could explain where they came from. He proceeded to ask the giant what kind of monarchs he was talking about. Then the giant replied that they were the longtime enemies of the rulers. And Jinwoo realized that if they were enemies of the rulers, then they were also his enemies, so he asked the giant if that was how they had bound him. To this the giant replied that it was right, for he too is a ruler, and perhaps the rulers and monarchies are already coming after him, and he has not the power to resist them all now. But he would need more power to go against them. But Jinwoo didn't understand what kind of power he was talking about, and the giant started to ask that he would release him and he would help him. But Jinwoo asked, who is going to help whom? The monster to the man? And he offers to take his word for it, but the giant started smiling and saying, I'll have to make you believe. And just as the ruler of the giants started to use some strange skill, at that very second, a notification window appeared in front of Jinwoo. It said that the king of giants is the first ruler to apply the skill Oath of Loyalty, and if he takes this oath, then whoever uses this skill will not be able to lie to each other. And Jinwoo wondered what he should do. Without thinking long, he took an oath, and at that moment, the Pledge of Allegiance was taken. The Hunt Rabbit started to ask him to release him and he would help him, but Jinwoo was now completely sure that this was how the oath worked, and he wouldn't be able to lie even by force. Jinwoo started to ask him how he could freely dialogue unlike the other magical monsters, but the ruler of the giants didn't understand what magical monsters he was talking about, and Jinwoo asked him again that he meant the monsters that come out of the gate. The king of giants answered him that he meant the chaos dwellers, and the ruler of giants was interested in how he could put the ruler and the chaos dwellers on the same level, as well as the ones that get out of the dungeons, which are the soldiers of the defeated army and those caught by the ruler's army. Naturally, they have defects after years of influence. The ruler kept saying that he was a king, unlike them, and he was able to keep his sanity. He remained calm for many years, waiting for the moment of release from their hands. And so, he waited for a hunter named Jinwoo. But Jinwoo remembered about the ruler's army and began to wonder if it was not the ones in white armor with wings by chance. To which the giant replied that that was right, they were the ruler's warriors. And Jinwoo asked him why they were sending the monsters. Well, the ruler started to answer, didn't he tell him that they were preparing for war and were going to turn this planet into a battlefield to fight the rulers? But Jin understood everything, of course, for he says, they are going to monsters to turn the earth into a battlefield. But the ruler replied that the reason is simple, they want to breathe magic into their world. If the monsters coming out of the gate is a disaster, then the release of magic is, on the contrary, a boon. And not only hunters, but also ordinary people considered soul crystals and mana stones as objects filled with magic, the best sources of energy. It turns out that it was all about making war, for the spilled blood of those who flow with magic is the best way to bring power to a place where it never existed. And for this, the monarchies decided to use the prisoners, and the concentration of magic on this planet began to grow only because of their blood. The magic has strengthened their planet, and their plan is to create a world that will not collapse under the onslaught of their power. Jinwoo realized that this is the second war between the rulers and monarchs. Soon their world will become hell, and the ruler began to say that there is no time now. And once it is known that they have met, neither the rulers nor the monarchs will stand aside. And who knows, perhaps the messenger of the rulers had already started to act, but Jinwoo started to ask him what he had said up to this point, that he was their target and why. But the ruler realized that he really doesn't know anything, in fact the power that he has is not his. But the fact that it is in his possession is a confirmation that the original master of the power betrayed the rulers and became an enemy to the monarchs and rulers. But the giant started to swear that he would fight on his side if Jinwoo would help him. But Jinwoo started telling him that usually when he wants to win someone over to his side, he just turns them into his shadow soldier. What the ruler noticed was that for a moment, this guy's image changed and he started talking about rulers and monarchs gaining immortal bodies. Even if you kill their body, you can't extract their body, but he can become their soldier. The ruler turned to Jinwoo, saying that he now had enough reasons to help him. Jinwoo now understood the whole situation, but still he was somehow uneasy, for he was definitely missing something. As he got closer and closer to the ruler, he began to tell him that if he helped him, he would take his side, and the ruler promised to return the favor, because it was a deal between the rulers. But the ruler thought about the fact that for a second that guy was blocked by a shadow, but it was just an illusion. And Jinwoo started to cut the chain and says that then it turns out that he is on the side of the people. But suddenly Jinwoo asks why he's not talking. Could it be because of the oath? And suddenly she noticed that the stone on his neck, and it turns out that he also hears the monarch's voice telling him to kill people. At this point, the ruler started to get angry and tried to hit the hunter, to which Jinwoo started to say let's pretend the deal didn't happen and it's too dangerous to let him live. So Jinwoo stuck his blade into him, because he realized that this could turn into a disaster. But the ruler began to say that he was wrong, for it is not him who is in action, but you. And just as the ruler tried to attack again, Jinwoo was faster and was able to dodge to attack back. He jumped uphill and moved behind his opponent's back, starting to kick him in the stomach with very fast punches. As a result, His opponent fell to the ground and started talking about how the fiercer the battle between the inhabitants of his world and the inhabitants of the Chaos World, the more the world would turn into a battlefield. Then everything he was trying to protect would simply be engulfed in the flames of war. But Jinwoo replied that this would not happen and eventually defeated the boss of this dungeon and was able to eliminate one of the 9 rulers. Jinwoo realized that it might take some time because of his great experience, and he felt sorry that he couldn't get shadow soldiers. Holding some strange thing in his hand, he began to think that it would be a trophy. At that time, one of the helicopters flew to a fancy house. And as soon as the helicopter landed, 2 people got out of it and the owner of the house, which was a national-level hunter, Christopher Reed. He started to say that he didn't know that somebody was going to come to see him, and he saw that it was the deputy and Ms. Selner. They wanted to talk to him and asked if he could ask everyone to leave the house, to which Christopher told his subordinates that no one was to go near his room until the 2 had left. A little while later, they were sitting in one of the rooms and Christopher began to ask them what had brought them here. If it was because of another dungeon that had appeared in the east, he would tell them straight out that he wasn't going. But Selner started to say that that wasn't why she had come, because there was a bigger problem. But Christopher didn't understand what that bigger problem was, that it would be more dangerous than even a level 9 dungeon. So Selner started to say that there was a possibility that someone would try to kill him soon. After hearing this, Christopher set his coffee cup on the table and began to say that he certainly understood and was certainly grateful for her kindness. However, they are not in a relationship to joke around like that. Christopher started to get very angry and started saying who else was going to kill who. To this, Mrs. Selner began to tell him that she had a dream recently where he was surrounded by several male silhouettes and then he was killed. But Christopher didn't understand why they had come here to talk all this nonsense just because she had some dream. He started yelling that he shouldn't be bullshitting, because he knew what they were up to before they woke up. They've had a lot of rumors, including the real reason why their abilities are so different from others, and maybe it has to do with the fact that she was a psychic in the past. Christopher says that he is a national-level hunter, which means that no one can kill him. Selner went on to say that she saw everything clearly in her dream, to which Christopher replied that let's say he believes her, what's next? Does he need to ask someone for help? And do they really think there is anyone in the world capable of protecting a national-level hunter? Christopher went on to say that it was already clear by his guesses that there was no such person, and what was the point? But suddenly Mrs. Selner began to say that there was one, and it was a Gene W. Hunter. Maybe he could protect him. Jinwoo was coming out of the magic gate at this time, thinking that he had done the right thing by killing the king after all. A suffocating aura emanated from him even when he was shackled, and if such a monster got out, there would be even more destruction than there was now. It was very good that he realized it in time. He also started to think about the fact that he needed to become even stronger. After all, the news that all the giants had been exterminated had quickly spread around the world, and social media had started a heated discussion about the proposed hunter on a national level. Compared to the raid on the island, it wasn't just Koreans who were affected by the topic. One of the giants that tried to cross the sea was defeated by Jin hunters in China, and the head of Japan's Matsumoto Association voluntarily surrendered to authorities. And no one knows if he tried to take responsibility for what happened. On the other side of the earth, in Maryland, USA, American hunters who had successfully completed a raid into the dungeons decided to hold a buffet at the government's expense, and in part of the end of the raid, the government spent a lot. For the buffet was lavish. The hunters chatted about how the raid that was recent was too easy. After all, they thought it would be harder. But suddenly the head of the guild came up and said that he was looking for them, if they remembered their argument. That one of them put a yacht there, and another put his house there, and the third put on his expensive tie. The head of the guild ended up taking it for himself, and a little while later he met with his assistant. She immediately told him that the tie he was wearing was quite expensive, but it didn't go with the Hawaiian shirt at all. The head realized this and tossed the tie aside, whereupon the girl started telling him that they had bigger problems. The Hunters Department had sent out a list of guilds invited to the international conference, and among them was the Ajin Guild. This was Hunter Jinwoo's guild. The guild head smiled because he realized that he would be flying to America soon. At this time in Japan, the giants were looking at their king Jinwoo, who was observing that with the exception of the giant that escaped into the sea, he had significantly replenished his combat power. But the soldiers behind him didn't understand how such a thing was possible and how one could have such an incredible ability to summon such huge creatures. The real nearby Jinho saw the surprised faces of the soldiers, and he began to realize that those who had never seen his mentor in all his glory only had to stand there with their mouths hanging open. But suddenly the huntress came up to him, started to pull his hand, in which there was a phone, and said that it was him who was calling. And as soon as he picked up the phone, he was dumbfounded by what he heard. And at that moment, he began to speak. "Jinwoo, it looks like I need to go back to Korea. I don't know, but apparently there was a problem at home and I should go back." And after a few minutes, the huntress girl started saying that they would take him to the airport, and as soon as he got into the helicopter, he started to realize that his heart was pounding as hard as if it never had before. He wondered what had happened, but he stopped thinking about it and hoped that nothing serious had happened. It was already a little while later, at the international airport, a man approached Jinho and started saying that his car was already waiting and he should follow them. He should brace himself in such a difficult hour, stay calm, and all the details would be explained to him on the way. But Jinho did not understand what it could mean, and it was difficult for the man to explain in a nutshell. Nevertheless, he started to tell that his father was now in the last stage of a serious illness, but as soon as he saw his father chained to a hospital bed, he started to scream. He was stopped by another man and told that he couldn't go there now, because hunters who couldn't control their magic couldn't be allowed near him. Lowering his head, Jinho began to say to himself that it seems like he ended up being a useless son. But suddenly that man held out his hand, which had a book in it, and he started to say that the chairman had been working on this before he went into a coma, and he thought that maybe he would look for it when he woke up. But it seemed to be more important to Jinho right now. And as soon as he opened the book, he saw the entries and realized that it seemed to be something that had been passed down to him by his father, articles, contests and competitions that his son, his sister and his brother had participated in. He'd collected it all, even Jinho's latest accomplishments. He couldn't hold back the tears, for he realized that his father had never said he didn't love him, and it was just that his expectations were as great as his love. That man motioned for Jinho to go home, but for a moment, Jinho noticed as if someone walked near him, but he realized he was imagining it and they started to leave the hospital. But at that moment, Jinwoo appeared, and he didn't like that his friend was crying, because his tears hurt Jinwoo's heart. He began to approach the bed where the chairman was lying and took out a vial of Jinwoo medicine from his pocket. He left the hospital shortly thereafter, but on his way out he met a lady who had come to the same hospital. They crossed paths on the way out and she realized that the man was her brother's friend. As soon as she entered the ward, she began to cry, for she saw that her father had woken up. The doctors standing by him realized that this was an absolutely amazing case and he had come out of the last stage of sleeping sickness. They couldn't even imagine how the media would react to this if they found out about it. Outside, Jinwoo smiled when he saw the lights on in the ward. He turned around and started to leave, thinking that even though it was a little early, happy birthday to Jinho, after all, it was his present. A little later, Christopher was thinking about whether he should go back to Japan and finally finish everything there. But suddenly he paid attention to his shadow exchange skill and saw that there was 1 hour and 54 minutes left before the skill reset. He started to think about what he could do in those 2 hours, because now he had free time. He didn't even know who to talk to or what to do. Remembering a hunter named Cha, Christopher thought he could meet her, but suddenly realized that it was already dark outside. Deciding to look for derelict dungeons, he headed down the dark hallway of his house. At this time, where he lived, Christopher was sleeping in his bed, but as if he felt something was wrong. He opened his eyes and started to get out of bed to look around. The silence was so profound that he didn't even hear the sound of the glass when he accidentally dropped it on the floor. A little later, as Christopher was contemplating whether he could go back to Japan and finally end things there, he turned his attention to his shadow exchange skill and noticed that he had 1 hour and 54 minutes left before the skill reset. He began to think about what he should do in the meantime, since he had some free time and didn't even know who to socialize with. When he thought of the huntress Cha, he decided that he could meet up with her. However, when he realized that it was dark outside, he decided to look for the derelict dungeons. At this time in the house where Christopher was staying, he was sleeping in his bed and felt that something was wrong. Opening his eyes and getting up from his bed, he headed down a dark hallway. Here he noticed that it was too quiet and decided to grab a wine glass to wake up. But as soon as he dropped the glass, he didn't even hear the clinking of shattering glass. But the two monsters behind him started to see the immortal fire, and they were surprised that a human was controlling it. But Christopher was already satisfied with evil and started attacking them to destroy them. At one moment, the whole house began to burn with bright flames, and at that time, Jinwoo was driving in the car. Through the car window, he could see very many people standing on the road and waving at him. All these people had gathered here to see Hunter Jin-woo, and it was estimated that there were about 100,000 people here. Inside the car, General Bear, who had appeared from the shadows, began to tell his king that these people had gathered here to express their gratitude to him, and he would in turn greet them. To which Jin-woo replied that that wasn't the case at all, and a little while later he was already sitting in an airplane seat and began to say, "What are the odds of meeting a familiar face right in the next airplane seat?" He turned to the man who was sitting next to him and began to tell him that if he said it was just a coincidence, to which the man replied that it would be nice, but apparently if he said that, the hunter wouldn't believe him. Jin-woo started to say that they had met Mr. Adam White again. I have to admit that he remembered his name, and that part for him to meet him, but Jin-woo didn't really know his name, and Bear here told him he couldn't or it would shake his image. Jin-woo asked him that they had already talked things over last time, and Adam knew that and that it was too impertinent of him to come like this uninvited. But he had an important conversation to have, and Jin-woo asked him, "Has America failed to contain the Gate S rank?" To which Adam replied that no, for there was nothing wrong with it. He then began to open his laptop and asked that Jin-woo take a look at it. Jin-woo started to watch a video where the firemen were saying that it was useless to try to put out these flames, because it was an unusual fire, and everyone should move away, because one touch and they would only be left with embers. But Jin-woo didn't realize what it was, but Adam told him to pay attention to the man behind the screen, and it was Christopher Reed, the one who started the fire. He was one of the strongest hunters on the national level. 18 firefighters and 14 top hunter mages had been mobilized to put out the fire he had started. Jin-woo realized that, in all likelihood, there was a battle there. Christopher was so strong that he was killed and no one could believe it. Adam started pulling a picture out of his pocket and said that it was a picture of who the Hunters Bureau thought was the prime suspect. Suddenly Adam began to rise into the air and a dark energy enveloped him. It was all because Jin-woo got so angry that his laptop that he was carrying twisted into a ball because of the dark energy. He didn't like the picture that was shown to him and started saying that if he was going to mess with him like that, be prepared to say goodbye to his life. To which Adam started yelling at him not to do that. He began to explain through the pain that the creature in the photo had come out of the dungeon, and maybe it wasn't who he thought it was. You couldn't tell from the magical energy that it was a normal monster, and besides, it immediately attacked their hunters. And if Jin-woo remembered the explosion that happened a few months ago, the incident that raised the whole world's ears, it was because of Jin-woo's father. After saying that, he put Adam back down on the ground and Adam started to say that he attacked their hunters and then escaped. After this incident, their bureau started to follow him closely, but they couldn't find any evidence, because it was like he vaporized and fell through the ground. Jin-woo understands the hunters' feeling as well, but they also have every reason to consider him the prime suspect. And Jin-woo asked him, then why did they show you this photo? To which he started to answer, at the International Guild Conference where all the most famous guilds from all over the world will gather, the Hunter Bureau will spread the word that he's a wanted man, which means the investigation will no longer be classified as secret. Jin-woo, looking at the pictures, realized that the American government had lost a valuable national-level hunter, and now they would do anything to catch the killer. However, Adam began to say that the Bureau of Hunters wished to continue to maintain a friendly relationship with him, so they wanted to give him advance warning about it, and he thinks it would have been embarrassing for Jin-woo to see his father's face at that conference as the prime suspect. Jin-woo couldn't believe that his missing father 210 years ago had turned into a monster and decided to come back. At that time, the guards approached Adam and started asking if he was okay, to which he replied that he was fine, just a malaise. What he was actually pondering was that Jin-woo possessed telekinesis, and this technique was completely different from the ones that mages used to move ordinary objects. He thought that it was only available to national-level hunters. Then it came to his attention that he himself was a national-level 6 hunter, and he needed to immediately inform the deputy head of the department. A little later, a conference at the International Guild was to discuss the main issues of the future development of the Hunter Society. A few days later, the list of invited guilds was released, and the Ajin Guild was chosen as South Korea's representative. This news was widely discussed around the world, including back home, as the only member was Jin-woo. However, the fact that one hunter could single-handedly handle entire guilds from other countries was the main argument in favor of Ajin. At the international conference, there were heated discussions about having Ajin Guild members instead of hunters. Mr. Choi Chonin was asked about this and replied that he thought this decision was quite reasonable, and he not only accepts it but also agrees with it. Indeed, that is exactly what he thought. But the question was asked again from the audience that because the Ajin Guild is literally made up of one person, and he wasn't embarrassed by that? To which he replied that that person was the hunter Jin Woo. And isn't that an argument? If they're comparing the guild in terms of the number of people who can fight high-ranked monsters, then he decided to say that Jin Woo could replace 100 of them. Besides, during the raid on the island, he had personally seen what he was capable of, and was willing to confidently say that Ajin Guild was not inferior to guilds from all over the world. But suddenly another guy stood up and began to say that still, considering that the Hunter Guild had represented Korea at the international conference year after year, he felt that such a decision might not satisfy him. To which Hunter Choi replied that he wouldn't be negative about it, and that it made him a little upset, since he had even renewed his passport to travel to America. But his sense of pride overpowered all his regrets, because in that raid on the island, when they thought hope had already faded, there was a hunter who didn't hesitate to challenge that ant, and in fact he and the guild members were able to return alive. It was only because of the hunter Jin Woo, and he was actually proud that he was the one who was chosen to represent their country. When the conference was over and the head of the Hunter Guild started to leave, he was met by a guy and started to say that they had booked a dungeon that appeared before lunch today in the Susa area, and it was A-ranked, but according to the measurements, it wasn't very dangerous. To which he was surprised that Ajin Guild didn't even bother to book it this time, and he realized that it had already been 4 days since Jin Woo had returned from Japan. After all these events, he didn't appear anywhere else, and for some guilds there was a celebration, but he was different from the White Tiger and the head of the Reapers. After all, what were they better than monkeys who were happy about the free apples that fell from the tree? But suddenly, the head of the Hunters Guild only heard a guy who was standing next to him saying that since Ajin Guild stopped meddling everywhere, sales had gone up by 40%, and the guild head realized that here was another monkey. He replied that it was no big deal and asked him what the association had to say about it. After all, before the second inspection, he was clearing 3 to 4 low-level dungeons each. Even after he became an S rank, he was already appearing in other guilds' territories. And a person who had just recently single-handedly dealt with dungeon monsters can just lay low like that. At this point in South Korea, in the office of the president of the Hunters Association, an inspector approached him and began to say that there was a request from China for information about Jin Woo. To which the president asked that the information about him was personal, and the inspector replied that it was not official data, but a request from the personal interest of Jin Woo's researcher. The president began to wonder why China was suddenly interested in Jin Woo, since they had made it clear that he was not interested in invitations from other countries. But the inspector explained that it wasn't the Chinese government that requested information about Jin Woo, but a Chinese 7-star level hunter named Lu Jigong. China has a system for evaluating hunters' abilities, and Lu Jigong is considered an outstanding hunter with 5 stars. He became interested in Jin Woo, perhaps because of their battle against the giants together. The president saw it as an acquaintance between the strongest and ordered the inspector to deny the request, suggesting that he write something superficial. At this time in America, in one of the guilds, a girl approached the head and reported the arrival of hunter Jin Woo, who was soon recognized by the president. But at this time, the hunter entered the room and surprised the guild head with his presence. He started to say that there was one urgent conversation and he would be brief. He asked him not to touch the hunter Jin Woo, who was coming to America tomorrow. He knows about what happened between his brother and Jin Woo and he has doubts, but at the same time he wants to know the truth. Suddenly, he saw a huge power in the form of his guild leader. It gave him goosebumps on his body. The guild head pointed his finger at him, otherwise he says that he doesn't recall letting him speak. The girl who was standing next to him pondered about him just doing what she was told. After all, not many people are able to threaten national-level hunters. The most dangerous among them is Thomas. However, Hwang Dong-soo is just as obsessed with hunting as Thomas. She repeatedly orders him not to touch the hunter Jin Woo under any circumstances. And so during the conference, he should go to the villa and get some rest. He asked again if he could fulfill his request, to which Hwang Dong-soo replied that he could. Then he turned around and started to leave. The girl standing next to him walked over to Thomas. He thinks he'll listen to her, to which Thomas replied that no, of course not, because he's not that stupid. He ordered his assistant Lola that until Jin Woo leaves America, she should keep an eye on Mr. Hwang Dong-soo. But she didn't think he would like it, but Thomas replied that like it or not, it was better than dying. The next day, all the guilds gathered in one building, and when almost everyone was already gathered, One of the hunters who was walking through the building didn't understand why there were so many reporters there. And the forgotten representative of the German guild, Richter, was reminded of his presence by his attendant, who explained that it was because of the arrival of the Korean hunter everyone was talking about. And at that moment, they saw that he was already here. Richter decided to say hello to him. After all, it would be good to make connections with strong hunters. As he started to walk, he suddenly stopped, noticing something. His escort asked why he wasn't walking, that he wasn't seeing what he was seeing. It turned out that he wasn't talking out loud, but just so he was walking along with them. With so many escorts, one could easily think that he was going to go to war on the States. Suddenly, Jinwoo turned his head, and Jinho started asking him if he saw any familiar faces. To which Jinwoo replied that he hadn't, but some foreigner kept staring at him. Jinho started to say that he's all they talk about on the news, and there's probably a bunch of fans already, and he probably just wants his autograph. Suddenly, Jinho started wondering why the boss with the association had come here. To which he, no strange expression on his face, started to say that he was assigned to guard Hunter Jinwoo, but he was even embarrassed to say it out loud. But that Jinho once again asked what he said there, and he replied that to guard the hunter. And suddenly Jinwoo started to say that he thought they had come to meet him after all, and the man in front of him started to say that they were waiting for the hunter. To which Jinwoo replied that he thought he heard that they were in charge of Asia and Adam. To which she says that he is now in charge of Jinwoo's hunter. I there started to say that all but Hunter Jinwoo they will take to the hotel. I even suggested could he go with them to some place, but Jinwoo beautifully serious face that it has to do with his father. To which Adam replied that this conversation wouldn't hurt him in any way, and didn't he say that they were thinking of him here in the US? But what they would be talking about was classified, and some of the items were classified level 1. Sitting in one of the cars a little later, Jinwoo started asking where they were going, to which Adam replied that to the building in charge of the hunters, and in fact time is really pressing on them right now. And since Christopher, their strongest hunter, is dead, they need to bolster America's fighting power right away. However, the data about Mr. Christopher's death is unofficial, and they are offering all their strength to find a hunter to replace him sooner rather than later. And Jinwoo asked him that he is one of the contenders. But Adam started to show the records and said that he, as he surely knows, is proportionally strong as a magical monster who had this stone as well. Right was a huge disaster for humans and was a historical event that one would rather want to forget. The dragon reed and the rune stone that was pulled from this dragon caused a desire to find the owner of this stone. Adam asked what the hunter thought about their proposal, but Jinwoo asked Adam to zoom in on the photo. He wanted to see the very first photo and started looking at the photo that showed Reed's body. Jinwoo couldn't believe that the US had preserved the dragon's body. To this, Adam replied that it was true, but Jinwoo wanted to know where it was hidden and needed to go there soon. After all, he was happy to give his time to him, so he could ask for at least that in return. But Adam began to reply that he knew that this was only information that had been authorized from above, and the location of Reed's body was also unknown to him. However, he feels that if he asks for it, things will be resolved quickly at the top. He needs to provide a report, and he suggested to Jinwoo if he would agree to wait a bit, to which Jinwoo replied that since he would have to wait, he would go with him and wait there. And a little later, when he came to the higher authority, he started to tell him that the hunter had come here and wanted to see the dragon's body. That man started to say that he needed to talk to the deputy head of the building. And as soon as Adam left, the two guys who were standing in the room began to reason. Why does he want to see the body of Reed? The other guy didn't even know, because the only thing you could be sure of was that he wasn't just a tourist. And the value of his skills is immense. High-level hunters don't save money on the runes and stones they need. Skills are a power that hunters have, and their lives are directly dependent on them. Being able to see the body can give him more than gaining skills. Another man asked if his abilities weren't limited to the magical monsters he defeated. After saying that, they realized that if he could make a rumored monster that wasn't killed by him and was long dead, he might even make Kamish his servant. If that was true, then they should definitely refuse him, for one man's powers should not be allowed to grow so much. But the other men said that, however, if they refused his request, it might be difficult to keep friendly relations with him. Things became clear then, and the man began to say that he would personally guide him, and maybe this would be a great chance to look at his skills in person. A little while later, they were walking down the floors, and as they walked down, the man began to think about how he wished the environment was calmer. Jinwoo stood nearby and pondered the fact that they had built a building on the site of Reed's death. It was unbelievable. A little while later, they continued down the hallway and the man leading them told them to follow him. As they approached a large door, he began to enter a password for the door to open. Jinwoo began to realize that he could feel the magical energy in the air. When the doors opened, he realized that this energy had lasted for 8 years after the events. He wondered how much strength the dragon would show when it became a shadow soldier. Inside the large room, they saw the skeleton of a large dragon that was very huge. The man began to say that he had killed all the powerful hunters, and only the remaining 5 on the state level were able to capture him like this, already dead. All the magical powers used in the building come from the magical reed stone. He then turned to the hunter Jinwoo, asking if he was satisfied. The hunter replied that they needed to step back, and Jinwoo began to approach the body of the reed stone. The men behind him began to scrutinize what was about to happen. Jinwoo was talking about the method of resurrecting the dragon and how to extract the shadow to cause the rebirth. He could feel the dark energy appearing, and in the end, he was unable to extract the shadow, with only 2 attempts left. Jinwoo sighed and started to try once more to resurrect the huge dragon that was very powerful. The second time, he also said, "Here rise." And dark energy enveloped the skeleton, from which a huge dragon began to appear. It started screaming furiously, and everyone in the building was terrified. After all, they didn't expect to see something like this, and the entire building began to shake in all directions and crumble. The barrier began to crumble, and all the corpses that bound the building, and the huge dragon screamed and began to tell the hunter that he was the one who had summoned him, the king of the dead, the lord of the shadows. Not the men who stood behind the hunter. They understood what was happening, for this was some kind of horror. But the dragon began to say that he needed to kill the man and all men, and the barrier that held the dragon back began to crumble little by little. Whoever was in charge of that building looked at the glass reinforced by the top-level mage and saw it simply shatter. And that dragon began to gather energy to destroy everything in that room. The other men started to say to their lord, well, they need to leave. But that man says it's the breath of the reed where he suggests they hide from it. Suddenly Jinwoo started saying to calm down, and the magic stone has long been removed from his head and he doesn't have to take orders from the monarch anymore. But those men noticed that Jinwoo was speaking in the language of monsters, and the other man himself didn't know how to explain it, what he was seeing. The dragon began to say that this is what it feels like to be summoned by the Shadow Lord. The dragon began to bow with the words, "Pathetic servants of the Dragon King." But Jinwoo couldn't understand which Dragon King he was talking about. To which the reed dragon began to say that that was right, he was serving the king of the wild dragons, the ruler of destruction. After saying that, Jinwoo began to feel a huge rage, and he couldn't believe that this shadow soldier could be so strong. It's on a completely different level from the monsters he had managed to encounter before. This is truly an incredible creature. Suddenly, the man who was standing behind noticed that this large and terrifying dragon began to move its tail like a small dog being stroked on the head. Jinwoo realized that the king of the dead, the Shadow Lord, and also the giant rabbit ruler, so he was one of the 9 rulers that the system showed. But suddenly the reed began to say that he would have to say goodbye to him, because he was afraid that they had met too late, and Jinwoo realized that even with the power of a Shadow Lord, he couldn't bypass those 8 years. Reed began to fade away and said that he envied the warriors who would be able to serve him forever. Lastly, he said that there were 4 people who had borrowed power from the monarch and he should be wary of them. It was important for him to meet the new king, even if the system showed that it had failed to extract the shadow and further attempts were pointless. Jinwoo turned around and walked over to the man, beginning to tell Adam to convey his apologies to the department head. He would provide all the help he could to rebuild the place and started to walk away. But as soon as those men turned around, they saw Jinwoo punching the wall with anger, which instantly bent. He was too angry about not being able to obtain such an amazing shadow soldier. That night, an inspector from the association met him and started asking him why he wasn't answering his phone, to which he replied that he had spent some time in a place where there was no network. The inspector asked if he had seen the hunter Jinho, as he said he saw to answer our call, and said he was waiting for him at his office. But Jinwoo started to say that he had just returned from there and didn't know what it was about. Suddenly Adam came over and said that Jinho was not on the guest list. The inspector couldn't believe it, because just 2 hours ago a hunter from the Vultures personally came and said he would see him off. The Vultures have a close relationship with the management, but are not authorized to act on their behalf. The inspector decided to contact the Vultures directly, but at this time, Jinwoo had a bad feeling. The girl sitting in the vulture department received a call that someone from the vultures had taken the banner of the Ajin Guild. She realized that she knew who it was. The inspector was standing around the corner talking on the phone, and he was asked if Jinwoo knew anything about it. He started to say that he didn't know anything, and at that time someone introduced himself by his name. The girl told the inspector that she would find out as soon as possible, and shortly after that call, the inspector started telling Jinwoo that the vultures had said they would find out everything and just had to wait for word. But Jinwoo wasn't there anymore. He ran to the tallest building in the city and realized that he had made a mistake by not putting guards at Jinho's place, using shadow swapping to protect the representative. He wouldn't forgive himself if something happened like what happened to his sister. And at that moment, he began to summon his shadow soldiers. I order everyone to search for Jinho in the bride's net. The soldiers began to sort themselves out in different directions, but at this time, in one of the rooms, the guild leader saw that his subordinates had escaped. As soon as he took off his glasses, he realized what he had done after all, and the deeds of that damn Huang Dongsu. He started ordering his subordinates to find him before Jinwoo got to him, so it wouldn't be worth it. And one must be sure to find him first. A few hours later, as it got darker, Jinho stood at one known spot and watched as his shadow soldiers darted all over the city. He could hear people talking and suddenly realized that Jinho had probably left the city. But Jinho was a hunter of fairly high rank, and ordinary people, even in large crowds, were unlikely to overpower him. If he was taken away in another direction, the Hunter Bureau would immediately suspect something amiss. More importantly, the kidnapper had given him one clue: it was a scavenger guild. If this type belonged to the scavengers, then it was none other than Huang Dongsu's younger brother. To find out the truth, he decided to trap them once they were in America. After all, he and Jinho were the only survivors of that raid. Jinwoo was sure that Huang Dongsu suspected them of his comrade's death, and what Jincho warned them about at the time happened. He doesn't regret what he did back then, but if he had left another soldier with him, it wouldn't have happened. If something happens to Jinho, he will destroy everyone involved. But at this time, the head of the scavenger guild sat on his chair and asked his subordinates, have they found Huang Dongsu? To which he heard the answer that no. And the guild leader understood that he was fed up with his life, and of course, he was also an S-rank hunter. However, he himself should also realize that he was as far as the moon to Jinwoo, and since Mr. Huang had left, he knew from the beginning that he would interfere. And the head realized that, perhaps, he had been too soft on the hunters lately. He started calling Laura, his assistant, and asking her how the situation was. To which she began to say that thanks to the Bureau's information, she had been able to track Mr. Han's movements over the past month, and apparently he had visited a place 3 times that was nowhere on his schedule. So the head started telling her to get all their guys over there right away, and he's moving out too. And lastly, he asked her how she managed to convince the people at the Bureau to cooperate with them. What if they don't find Huang? How important is it that they find him quickly? It is a high probability that you will soon encounter the hunter Jinwoo. At this time, everyone in the Bureau started to get up from their workstations. After all, one of the guys ran in and said that all the members of the Scavenger Guild had suddenly become active, all 100 of them, and they had even cancelled the raid. And now all the hunters had all gone to one location. And since the entire Scavenger Guild had come forward, it meant that Thomas was behind them. They didn't know what was going on. But at this time, in one abandoned room, 3 hunters from the Scavenger Guild were standing beside the hunter Jinho who was bleeding. Their Wandansu began to say that they wouldn't kill him, just to find out a few things. Mr. Thomas asked him not to touch hunter Jinwoo, but he wasn't going to mess with him from the beginning. After all, there is one more person who can answer his question if he doesn't lie and is honest about what happened in the dungeon. Then he would be released. Huang Dongsu only wanted one thing, to hear that Jinwoo killed his brother. Once he confirmed his words, he wouldn't need Jinho anymore. And at that very second, he leaned over to Jinho and started telling him to start getting up. And he slapped his chest to make him wake up. But the other hunter who was standing near them started saying that he was doing pretty good, and probably a tank. And if it were an ordinary person in his place, he would have died by now. But Huang Dongsu didn't understand how this dumbfounded boy could keep his mouth shut so stubbornly. Although his bravery was commendable, recklessness was unforgivable. So he slammed his head with all his might against the iron surface that was beyond his day, and began to tell him that he was not going to kill him, for the fellow beside him was a skillful hitman, and so even when he was on the verge of death he would be able to pull him out. and until he heard the truth out of him he would suffer terrible pain. And he began to say that this place had long been abandoned about 5 years ago, and no matter how much he screamed, no one would come to help him. To which Jinho started telling him to go fuck himself. Huang Dongsu hit him even harder, but those hunters who were standing nearby began to tell him to act more cautiously, for he wouldn't want to be involved in a murder for money, and asked him to leave him alone. After all, he thought, they had already learned enough. But Huang Dongsu looked at his face and started to say what he was talking about. They had just started, but suddenly the hunters noticed that an orc had appeared, looking straight at them, and Huang Dongsu couldn't understand where he had come from. He realized that there must have been a break in the dungeon nearby, and he started to walk towards it. But as soon as they looked at that orc, they wondered what he was scared of when he saw the hunters. And just as the hunter in the bathroom swung at the shadow orc soldier, at that moment, Jinwoo's voice sounded out about the exchange. At the same time, his mother and sister were watching TV and began to hope that his son was alright. But a shadow began to appear behind them. It was the shadowy soldier who was guarding them, and he started saying that the king's mother. If anyone dares to anger the Lord, they will not live. They were watching TV and saw the events from the US start to be told. Currently, the event arranged by the Hunter Bureau was showing Jinwoo. But suddenly, Shadow Soldier Bear began to feel a strange feeling. At this time, a bunch of hunters who were going on a raid started to talk about how recently in the dungeons, the monsters have become unpredictable and you never know what will happen there. So no one should let their guard down, and no one should get hurt. But suddenly, the other hunter noticed that the shadow that was near his feet began to tremble. But his partner thought he was just messing with him, because he wanted to intimidate him before the raid. But something that guy started getting angry and yelling at his mentor that he didn't seem to take a drop today either, and it's like his shadow is alive. He's really talking, and at the same time, the head of the scavenger guild was driving his car and started telling his driver to stop. He realized it had already started and kicked the car door with his foot to start getting out of the car. He told his driver that he was going to walk by himself and let him catch up. At that very second, he started jumping from seat to seat to get to the guys who were sitting in the front seats as soon as possible. They started talking about how tomorrow they would have to seek compensation for the damage he had done again and didn't understand if they couldn't just drive the car. "Come on already," Jean said, hitting the Vandanza, causing it to start flying away a few hundred meters. The two hunters, who saw who it was, began to tremble with fear, for they saw a terrifying force in front of them. Jinwoo ran straight to Jinho and started treating him with the healing potion he had. But the notification system showed that if his health level dropped below 10%, the effects of the healing potion would be neutralized. Once he realized this, he raised his gaze to the two hunters who were standing beside him and began to ask them if there was a healer among the two of them. With a horrified face, he told them to heal Jinho immediately. One of the hunters started to say that they didn't quite understand Korean, but suddenly Dongsu appeared and started telling them that he told them to heal this puppy. He was happy to meet Jinwoo. Our hero told one of the hunters one last time to heal his friend, to which he heard that they had to ask the boss first if he would let them heal that guy. But as soon as he finished speaking, Jinwoo grabbed his head with her hand and slammed him with all her strength against the nearest wall. This caused him to fall to the ground. At the same moment, another hunter started telling Dongsu that he didn't warn them that this guy was related to Jinwoo. Our hero started to say that he clearly asked him if he could cure Jinho, and then the hunter started stuttering terribly. Only a few seconds passed and Jinwoo used his ruler skill to pin that guy to the ground, causing him to start piercing the ground with his body. Dongsu, who was getting closer and closer, started to say that he thought so, and after all, he was the one who killed his brother, Huang Dong-suk. But Jinwoo stood still and heard Jinho tell him to be careful with this guy. To which Jinwoo replied to stop talking and better conserve his strength. But what Dongsu wanted to hear the answer was whether he killed his brother and his team. To which Jinwoo told him to go and ask him himself, and at the same moment Dongsu began to attack our hero. But Jinwoo dodged the attack and kicked him in the ribs with force, which sent him flying a few meters away. But he also crashed into the nearest wall. That wasn't the end of it. He lay down next to the bent pipe he ran into and started to get even angrier. But at that moment, our hero was already standing over him and was ready to hit him again. After a second, our hero hit him even harder, and because of that, he bent the nearest pipe that was lying below him. Our hero began to beat him even harder that the sounds of blows could be heard all around. But suddenly the head of the Scavenger Association, Thomas, appeared and began to tell Jinwoo to calm down. He warned him not to get into a fight with him and asked him if he was alive. To which our hero replied, breathing for now, and Thomas went on to say that in that case their conversation would be short and he would pretend nothing happened. And he would let it go. After all, this is the most appropriate option. To which our hero replied, what happens if that doesn't suit me? And Thomas began to say that then this conversation will be over. But our hero got tired of waiting and tossed Dansu aside. As soon as he hit the ground, he began to rejoice that now Thomas wouldn't have to stay but to intervene and tear him to pieces. As soon as our hero approached Thomas, he began to say that he so realizes that Jinwoo doesn't even know who he is. To which our hero replied that he didn't care who he was. And Thomas thought about the fact that if he had known him a little better, would not have rushed into battle so recklessly. After all, Thomas Andre grew up in a poor immigrant family, and because of this, many people treated him with contempt. Despite this, the heavens had gifted him with a superior talent that seemed to be the dream of every person in this world. It was an overwhelming ferocity and strength that could crush others. He always displayed his natural ability in battles and thus saw his power change depending on his opponent, strength, power, brutality. He was like a king who possessed the whole world, ruling over people. And when a completely different kind of power appeared in the world, who could finally establish himself as a king, he crushed everyone who stood in his way, about those who looked with contempt, forced to crawl on their knees before him. Thomas Andre is the epitome of cruelty. Thanks to his own experience, he always knew how to suppress those who refused to obey. Thomas swung around with words for him to blame it all on his stupidity. But the scavenger guild that had approached the place at this time realized that this was the very place where they were supposed to stop and wait for the boss's orders. But suddenly, they saw some noise, and something flew past them with terrifying force. As soon as the dust settled, they saw their boss, who was resurrected because he was thrown aside, for it was our hero who hit him so hard that he flew away for several hundred meters. His subordinates started asking Thomas if he was okay. And as soon as Thomas started walking, his entire guild started hurting him behind his back and following him. But at this time, Jinwoo ordered Igris to take Jinho to the nearest hospital and let the doctors take care of him. They must save him so that you will be gone. And as soon as Igris was up in the air on his dragon, our hero turned around and saw the scavenger guild standing across from him. And at that moment, he began to summon his shadow soldiers, and Thomas began to say what could be better in a good battle and spit on Huang Dongsu's ambitions right now. It's not that important, there's only one way to restore honor and kill that insolent man. But that wasn't enough for Thomas. So he began to say to our hero, if you admit your mistakes, I will spare you. But as soon as he looked up, he saw that our hero showed him the middle finger. Thomas started to get even angrier and shouted towards our hero, which would make him regret not taking his last chance. His body began to increase, as his magic power flew in the air. At the same moment, his entire guild was ready to fight the shadow soldiers that were standing. And as soon as our hero told him that he was approaching him to get kicked, the two formidable troops clashed in a fierce battle. The scavenger guild began to raise their shields to block the shadow soldiers. And just as a huge explosion sounded, several dozen shadow soldiers flew apart. It was Thomas Andre who started to attack everyone, but suddenly he saw an orc standing in front of him who had prepared a large shield. But there was no stopping Thomas. He jumped up and struck with such force that he destroyed that shield and also felled the big orc. Thomas knew that the shadowy ones had an advantage in the air, so he started falling back into the same building, gaining all his strength. He hit the ground, causing a blast wave to rain down on the shadow soldiers. But suddenly, he saw his last scavenger guild mate receiving Luli from the shadow soldiers. Nearby stood Hunter Jinwoo, who finished him off. Suddenly, our hero saw Thomas approaching him with all speed. However, the general stood in front of him with his shield, but that didn't stop Thomas. With cries of "Get off!" he struck the Aaron, causing it to fly off to the side. As soon as Thomas looked up, he noticed that the Hunter Jinwoo had gone somewhere. At this time, our hero was already near his back and tried to strike him with his blade with great force. However, he realized that he couldn't penetrate his armor. Thomas struck the Hunter Jinwoo with tremendous force. In response to the blow, Jinwoo began to fly uphill. Thomas started to tell him that the national level was just a joke to him. Suddenly, Thomas swung, and the hunter realized that Thomas was using telekinesis to pull him towards him. Thomas wanted to show the difference in their strength and desperation. However, the hunter was not so easily defeated, and he used his special skill ruler hand to lock Thomas in place. But Thomas didn't realize what was happening and continued to try to attack Jinwoo. Meanwhile, the hunter took advantage of the fact that Thomas was pulling him towards him and increased the speed of his attack. When the hunter's hand reached Thomas's face, the impact was so strong that Thomas flew off into the distance. As he flew, he felt himself bleeding, and when he finally stopped, he realized that he was seriously injured. To gather his strength, our hero was already near Thomas and began to tell him what he had said earlier. He could feel the difference in their strength and desperation. In response to this, our hero started throwing many punches at Thomas. At this point, Thomas realized that he was losing and decided to stop underestimating his opponent. He started to strengthen his body, but at this time there were a lot of cars moving on the road to this battle. A guy who was behind the wheel of one of the cars approached Adam to find out what was going on here. However, Adam replied that he didn't have time for a detailed explanation right now. The driver still didn't understand what was going on and talked about how, perhaps being an ordinary civilian, he was unable to understand the situation. They decided to drive on and realized that their lives were in danger, for if they did not stop, they would face danger. At this moment, Jinwoo thought that there were 4 people who had borrowed the power of the monarchs, and it was likely that one of them was someone among the 5 who had survived the Reed raid. Thus, these 4 people had become national-level hunters, and Thomas Andre was no exception. And as soon as Thomas's enhancement reached the maximum, our hero started running towards him to attack. But Thomas raised his 2 arms and struck the ground with such force that all the ground under our hero's feet collapsed. He then jumped into the air and started using some strange technique called captivity. A strange orb appeared in his hand. The hunters who were fighting against the shadow soldiers began to realize what this technique was and shouted to their comrades to stay away from the master and get away as soon as possible. Suddenly, all the shadow soldiers who were near Thomas began to be sucked into this ball. Our hero stood on the wall and watched this incredible force, like a black hole that could suck him in if he didn't have the power of a monarch. But Thomas did not stop his action, and soon there was a huge explosion that caused half the building to collapse. But our hero managed to jump even higher and stand on a ruined beam. He looked down and saw Thomas standing below, next to a huge hole from his big black ball. Thomas, looking up at our hero, began to say that this time he wouldn't miss. The hunter from the scavenger guild were carrying the wounded little by little at first and were leaving themselves, trying to get as far away from this battle as possible. But suddenly, one of the hunters saw his boss standing looking up the mountain. In an instant, he jumped upwards with incredible speed and flew towards our hero. However, Jinwoo was not confused and met Thomas with his foot, causing him to fly backwards. At this moment, our hero started to use a grab and his ruler hand skill activated, started to attract Thomas, and then accelerated. Thomas couldn't believe his eyes as he realized that he was about to go for a frontal attack. Thomas was so confident in his strength that he was willing to take all of Jinwoo's attacks and started to use his enhancement even harder. But as soon as they clashed blows, Thomas's armor started to break and in an instant, Thomas flew out of the building. Jinwoo's punch was so strong that Thomas flew off in the debris of the building that lay nearby. Our hero didn't stop and ran straight at him. When he got closer, he saw that Thomas was also about to hit him, but he dodged in time. And at that moment hit Thomas with a strong blow with his knee on his head. At one point, Thomas realized that his armor wouldn't hold up. He needs to change his battle tactics. But at this time, Adam and his hunters arrived on the scene with their subordinates. As soon as they saw the battle, they couldn't believe their eyes, for it was an incredible power, and they didn't realize who were the monsters fighting there. One of Adam's subordinates started to say that it was not safe and they should be on their guard, but suddenly they saw something strange, because someone flew near them and for a moment it seemed to them that Thomas Andre had just flown in front of them. But one of the boys started to ask him what he would order them to do, but Adam knew it was a silly question. After all, surely they should stop him. But the one guy didn't realize who exactly. After all, the hunter Jinwoo, who was being beaten, lying on the ground and receiving many blows, couldn't understand how this was happening. A hunter with a 5 lich in magic can't deliver such powerful blows and such terrifying speed. It was probably the end. But suddenly he shouted that there was no way and never in his life would he lose. But our hero's next blow put an end to it. Thomas was taking even more damage and began to think that he had incredible power concentrated in his hands and was capable of overwhelming anyone. He started shouting that his name was Thomas Andrew and he would not lose, but the final blow that put a fat point, our hero started talking. So he said he didn't care who he was and kept beating him. But the feather hunters started yelling for Jinwoo to stop, but Jinwoo kept beating him, and until Thomas Andre realized that he had lost. He started saying that he was giving up. Literally, he was slammed into a wall and started saying he had lost. But the hunters from the brigade who were watching all this saw the incomparable Tomas Andres bowing his head, and they couldn't believe who could even do such a thing to him. And there are people in the world who can do that. If the public knows all about this, the whole world will be turned upside down. Suddenly, Adam started screaming for the healers to fix him as soon as possible, but the healer who was supposed to be there started saying that all his bones were broken and he was bleeding separately, and he couldn't do it alone. He needs another healer. As he started talking, and yet, he wasn't dubbed a national-level hunter for nothing. He's incredibly strong, and anyone else in his position would have fallen off the wagon a long time ago. After so much storage, the hunters began to look around and saw that there seemed to be no casualties. Adam, who was standing and holding his head, realized that all was not good. But suddenly one of the hunters from the brigade came up to him and started saying that Hunter Huang Dongsu was not breathing and his heart was not beating, and Hunter Jinwoo was nowhere to be seen. But at this time, our hero was in Korea and was sitting on the roof of a building. He switched places with BR, and he began to tell the shadowy soldier behind him that it had been a long time since he had been to Korea. And now the bustling soul was spread out in front of him, and while they were here, the hunters were actively engaged in treating Jin Ho in America. But all of a sudden, the shadow soldier who was behind our hero started to tell the Lord to give him a name. And this shadow soldier turned out to be Huang Dongsu, who had an unknown level and his rank was general. Our hero began to think about what name to give him, and he began to reflect that he died because of his greed. Thus, the name I want to give him is Grid, for it means greed in English. When our hero asked Huang Dongsu if he liked the name, he said that he was pleased that his king had chosen such a name for him. And at that moment, our hero told him that he should now back face down and face the next day in the International Guild Conference. Jinwoo was walking and noticed that there were a lot of reporters in this building. But the man standing next to him started to say that they must have already found out about yesterday's fight, and he was afraid that Jinwoo wouldn't be able to get away from them today. The bureau chief of the Hunters Association looked at Jinwoo and began to think that this person had completely destroyed the vulture, and they would provide witness protection for Huang Dongsu's case. The Association of Redundancy will see to what will be presented in the report. But our hero realized that he didn't need any problems related to Huang Dongsu, because he came here for only one purpose. As soon as everything is found out, he will immediately go back to Korea, and there is nothing for him to do here. When the head of the heroes gave our hero headphones, he said that he would translate the words that would be said through the headphones. As soon as our hero entered the huge hall, all the people sitting there began to turn around and look at him with strange looks. And they started discussing among themselves that he was the Asian hunter who had beaten Thomas Andre to a pulp. They also said that he had played a key role in the Tokyo Gate sweep incident, and that this guy had even managed to take down the head of the vultures. He was in charge of all the hunters in their country, and they couldn't believe their eyes. And as soon as our hero sat down at a free seat, the meeting started, and some man with glasses came on stage and started to greet everyone here. He began to say that he was Dr. Belzer, and he revealed that everyone here is already aware of the fact that the intensity of the gate's appearance has increased dramatically, followed by the level of monsters dwelling in it. However, not everyone here knows that there was unusual activity in the sky, and they had received many reports confirming the fact that the concentration of magical energy absorbed by the atmosphere had also increased dramatically. However, this case had never occurred before in the entire history of the Hunter and Dungeon system, so it could be considered unique in a way. And until they find a more suitable term for it, the doctor suggests calling this phenomenon Magosphere. And he began to show a map and explained that at the moment the Magosphere was concentrated in the atmosphere over the territory of several states, and a total of 9 places where convenient phenomena appeared had been discovered, and the greatest concentration of this force was concentrated in Seoul, South Korea. Suddenly, everyone present stirred, for they realized that the hunter Jinwoo was from there. The doctor began to tell them not to look at Mr. Jinwoo like that. After all, no hunter can control such power. But our hero started to realize that it means the gates appeared in 9 places, and maybe it has something to do with the number of lords. But the doctor continued to explain that they do not know the nature of this phenomenon and it is impossible to influence it due to the lack of any information. However, this does not mean that they will leave everything as it is, and perhaps their world is now on the threshold of great changes. And as soon as the doctor finished his report, a man appeared on the stage and began to say that he would continue. And as soon as he got behind the microphone, he began to say that he had an urgent announcement to make. And unfortunately, he has to inform everyone of some tragic news. About 2 weeks ago, Hunter Christopher Reed was murdered by a group of unidentified individuals. Those in attendance began whispering amongst themselves as to how it was that a national-level hunter had been murdered. And most of them thought it was probably a joke, since you have to have unimaginable strength to do that too, and started thinking that maybe it was the guy who had fought Thomas yesterday. The big screen started showing Christopher's body, and the man began to explain that the official report of Christopher's death would be released tomorrow, and everyone should listen to it carefully so that they wouldn't have any questions later on. After all, they have a suspect in the commission of this crime. As soon as they showed the suspect, it was Jin Woo's father, and everyone in the room started to look and think about the fact that there was another person behind all of this who was not Jin Woo's hunter. But this Asian man's face resembled the guy sitting behind them so much that two of the people present started whispering for no one to turn around. After all, they just look alike, because in any case all Asians are the same face to them, and it doesn't matter what he thinks about it. But our hero began to get angry, because he did not understand why his father went to the dungeon in the territory of the ruler. He began to remember the words of the dragon Reed, who said that only 4 people had gotten this power from them, and he should beware. Our hero didn't understand why the rulers sent a monster in the guise of his father here, but maybe it had something to do with what Kamish had said. The man on the stage began to say that the man found in the gate in the US territory had been identified as a monster capable of speaking a human language. Furthermore, they requested the help of an S-level hunter, Hwang Dong-soo, who spoke Korean, to help him conduct the interrogation. However, he knocked him out right in the middle of the process and turned the headquarters against the Hunter Association into a fiery ruin. The suspect was able to defeat Hunter Hwang Dong-soo, who was a member of the main body of the Vulture Guild. Therefore, there is a strong possibility that he and a group of humanoid monsters like him escaped from the dungeon and attacked Hunter Christopher Reed. That's the conclusion of the Hunters Association. But suddenly our hero noticed in the video that his father told the hunter Hwang Dong-soo not to even try to stick his nose in Korea, because he warns him for his own safety. Otherwise, there will be no peace for him even after his death. Jin Woo summoned Shadow Grid, to which he replied that it was correct. Jin Woo realized that undoubtedly this person was his father, and the man on the stage began to say that they wanted to request the help of guilds from all over the world to apprehend the suspect. Should he be found, he urged them to inform them immediately. But suddenly, one of the men from the audience started asking how they realized that this monster wasn't human at all, but the answer was heard that his magic power matched the energy redeemed by the monsters. Suddenly, the following question was heard: what do they say that he impersonated a man lost in the dungeon, and have they verified the identity? To which the man replied that yes, there was indeed such a person. The next question sounded like this: why won't you reveal the identity of this hunter? To which the man on stage began to say that he was related to one of the hunters present here, and so they had decided not to disclose that information. But suddenly someone raised their hand and began to say that it still wouldn't be more appropriate to reveal the identity of this man to make it easier to find him. And the person who asked this question was an all-star hunter from China, Jigong. He decided to ask straightforwardly, what does this monster have to do with Hunter Jin Woo? The man began to say that if he really wanted to know the truth, he believed he had no choice, and began to say that during the interrogation, the suspect referred to himself as Hunter Jin Woo's father. Therefore, they decided to investigate to confirm this fact. And Jigan began to ask Hunter Jin Woo how he would act in the event that his parentage was confirmed and the Hunter Society threw its forces to catch him. Jin Woo started to say that everything was already clear. The main prerogative of hunters is to destroy monsters. If this person really turns out to be one of them, he will definitely catch it and tear it to pieces. But if it is confirmed that it is his father, then anyone who dares to lay a finger on him will be destroyed. In that case, no matter what, he would defend his family. A little later, when everyone started to leave the conference room, the investigators from the Hunter Association started to ask Jin Woo if it was true that he would do such a thing, to which Jin Woo began to say that he was. The researcher remarked that to say such a thing in front of 500 strongest hunters representing more than 120 countries, there are probably only 2 hunters in the world who can do such a thing, and Jin Woo wondered who the other one was. To which the investigator replied that the one he had recently sent to his hospital bed was Thomas Andre. He went on to say that, by the way, on the occasion of the convening of the international conference, he was going to hold a lavish banquet, and to be honest, it took them quite a lot of effort and money to organize it. Therefore, if Jin Woo was not too busy, he would like to invite him. But suddenly our hero noticed that the 7-star hunter Jigan was coming in his direction. He started to say something, but our hero didn't understand a word, because it was Chinese language. So he started asking the investigator what he was saying, to which the investigator replied that he said he had caught a strange monster off the coast of China. Our hero was surprised that the investigator knew Chinese, to which the investigator replied that, in fact, he was in charge of the Asian area and spoke the languages of that group quite well. He proceeded to translate what Jigana had said, that he was amazed at the strength of this giant, and fighting him on the water proved to be quite problematic. From that moment on, he wanted to meet Jinwoo and see what he was really like, since he could easily defeat a dozen such strong monsters. He was also glad that someone had finally been able to rein Thomas in, and the fight about him had been exaggerated. But our hero reflected on the fact that at first this guy seemed too brazen to him, but now he sees that he is kind of not a bad person. Lastly, he said he hoped this suspect wasn't a member of his family and started to leave. The explorer started to say that he wasn't going to fight later, at least it seemed that way to him. But the hero replied, all the better. Suddenly a man came up to him and asked him to come with them, and a little later, in the other room, Jinwoo was sitting at a table and Mrs. Sellner was sitting in front of him, and she started to say that she hadn't seen him for a long time, but Jinwoo didn't understand why she needed him, because he really didn't expect to meet her again. And she started to say that she's been having some pretty strange dreams lately, and in them their hunters are being victimized by unknown creatures. But more importantly, a few days later they come true, and our hero realized that what she was talking about now touched Mr. Christopher. Because a few days before the tragedy, they warned Mr. Christopher about the guards leading the disaster, but he didn't listen to them, and eventually Jinwoo realized what was next. And she began to say that the better hunters who had kept the peace on Earth for years would die one by one, and those who hunted them were unusually strong and could not be stopped. Jinwoo started to tell her that if he got it right, he should beware of those creatures. To this, the girl replied that no. She wants him to protect the hunters and memorize the faces of those creatures, but she couldn't. So she decided to go a different way, and right in her dream she checked them out with her powers, just like the time she looked inside the hunter Jinwoo. And she began to say that there was infinite power underneath their disguises, and just looking at it terrified her. She immediately woke up in a cold sweat, and it was worth it to look into her eyes. She still can't forget that dreadful voice that fearfully whispered, "You have terrible words." She went back and waited for the war. Jinwoo realized that it was the same thing that Kralikatov had told him about, a war between rulers and monarchs. In that case, those creatures killing hunters, he wondered whose side they were fighting on. Our hero started to ask why they were asking him to protect the hunters, and that girl replied that the same power comes from him as those creatures. Jinwoo wondered if she had discerned the power of a shadow lord within him. And in that case, those hunters from her dream were most likely the rulers. The man who was standing behind the girl began to say that those creatures were very strong, and to stop them, they would need the help of the hunter, Jinwoo, as only he would be able to resist them. To be honest, they had initially doubted his abilities, but after yesterday's fight with Hunter Thomas, they had no doubts left. And needless to say, his labor would be generously rewarded, and Jinwoo could take anything he wanted with him. Even that rune stone placed after the reed. After all, their world has been blessed with hundreds of hunters endowed with immense power, and it is only because of them that America can still hold back the enemy. And if they disappear from the face of the earth, their world will not stand and will go under the onslaught of an unknown force. But Jinwoo apologized, and as soon as he wanted to speak, the man interrupted him and started to ask him if yesterday's incident with Hunter Thomas had put him in a personal grudge. But Jinwoo started to say that that wasn't the case, he just didn't know who he was going to fight yet, and at that very moment he stood up and started to say that he needed to go home. And just as he started to walk out, he suddenly stopped, sighed, turned around and started to say to Mr. White, could he then provide him with a list of the hunters who had requested protection from him, and it would be nice if they could also help him set up a meeting with them? To which Mr. White smiled and began to say that of course he would. On the last day of the International Hunters Conference, there was also a ladies' buffet where all the hunters were there, including Jinwoo and Jin Ho. And our hero began to ask his deputy if he was alright, to which he replied that he was more alive than anyone else, and what he heard was that he had fought Thomas Andre, the Goliath of our age, because of him. He almost cried. The hunters standing nearby started whispering about looking the other way, and one of the hunters said that he had seen it, and he couldn't even feel its magical power, for it was on a completely different level. Plus, he fought Thomas Andre to save his deputy. Suddenly, one of the hunters approached Jinwoo and started saying that he would like to meet him. It was the director of a company that specialized in recycling the remnants of magical monsters, and he wanted to purchase the giants he had recently killed from him. Would Jinwoo be able to give him some of his time? Here, Jinwoo realized that the first hunter had gone and started to say that he was mainly in charge of organizing raids to clean the dungeons, and business matters lay with his deputies, Vice President Jinko. He immediately approached him and began to say that he was glad to meet him, and, to tell the truth, he preferred to discuss such issues in a more private setting, but since he was already the head of the company, he could talk now. Our hero looked at his friend and realized that this puppy had already got the taste and really felt like a vice president. At that moment Mr. White appeared and started to say that he had brought the list he had asked for. When our hero looked at the ranking of the hunters, he realized that it was ranked according to their activities and overall contributions. The first 10 people had the highest score and would most likely be offered first. It turns out that they are the priority right now. Jinwoo also asked Mr. White what kind of place he would have been given there. He replied that, given his battle with the giants, it would probably be somewhere around 3rd or 4th place, as Thomas Andre was 1st, Lu Jigan 2nd, Christopher Reed 3rd, and Siddharth Bachchan 4th. But it was a lot of names for our hero, and he didn't want to memorize each one, so he decided it was better to just introduce all the soldiers and call it a day. Anyway, it would be easier that way. And that way, he'd be able to contact the rulers faster and figure out who was an enemy and who was an ally, and how he should fight them. But suddenly everyone present froze in place. For they saw Mr. Thomas start to walk into the room, and as soon as Jinwoo turned around, he saw that Thomas wanted to ask one question and started to show his hand. He was told that healing magic wouldn't help here as his injury was too great, and the same thing the doctors said. Sure, his arm is slowly healing, but it will take much longer to fully recover. He could have easily destroyed him and his entire guild. However, why didn't any of his guys die in that commotion except for Mr. Huang, and why did he spare them? To this, Jinwoo replied, because they didn't deserve to die and there was nothing to kill them for. And at that point, Thomas turned around and started to walk away, and lastly said that he planned to hold a lavish funeral for Mr. Huang. Even though he didn't deserve to die, Jinwoo should forgive him for at least that. By the way, when his arm healed, he offered to have lunch together sometime, but only if he left his phone number to his secretary. And at that moment, the secretary came over, bowed and started speaking on behalf of the master. She wants to say thank you to him for not harming their guild members, and asked for his phone number so that the mister can thank him for appearing good-natured towards their guild. Jinwoo can let him know if he needs anything, but he replied that he doesn't need anything, everything is fine. 666. The secretary went on to say that their master doesn't like to lose, he will tear up until he pays someone back. Is it possible for you to ask for something from him? Jinwoo hesitated and started to say let it be some useful blade or dagger. After that, the secretary bowed and thanked Jinwoo once again. As soon as she left, Mr. White started talking about how they had a meeting with the hunters on the list next, and he could guide and introduce them. To which Jinwoo replied that he shouldn't and started asking that there was one person missing from the list and he didn't see hunter number 6. But Mr. White began to say that they had lost contact with him a few days before the conference and their association had tried to secretly search him through Brazil. But they were told he never came back, and Jinwoo realized what that meant. He had been killed and there were 7 left. At this time, the president of the association was sitting in his office, and he had a strange feeling, for his heart had been ailing lately. Although he had had problems before, but the fact that it was getting worse and worse every day, he soon began to realize that it was the end, because the doctor said that if he did not resign, he would be enough for 6 months at the most. A year went by, then 2, and here he is and he can't do anything about it, for he has already brought his limit. Suddenly he noticed that he had received a phone call. As soon as he picked up the phone, they started telling him that nothing unusual had happened today. It was his wife, and he rolled over in his chair and started to say that he was going to go home anyway. But suddenly the president began to feel some strange force that was around him, and he didn't realize what it was. But suddenly he saw some strange creature appear at the end of the hall and someone was sitting on a chair. As soon as he looked closer, he saw the strange creature sitting in the distance and smiling. The president started to ask him if he wanted to talk to him and started to turn in his direction, but that creature that was sitting across from him made the president feel that his aura was almost intangible and he would not be able to handle him. But that creature started telling him not to worry, because this place was completely isolated from the outside world and no one would disturb them. The president thought that maybe it was a dream, and suddenly at the same moment a snowy thing flew to him and hit him in the shoulder, and the creature started to say that the pain was also part of the dream, and the president realized that everything was real, and started to ask that creature again who he was. That creature started to get up and say that he wanted so badly to torture him some more in guessing, but it turns out that you're actually an ordinary person. But the president couldn't understand what he was trying to say, and then the creature started to show his incredible power, and telling the president to excuse him, because he doesn't like to mock the weak, and the president should show him a shard of light right now, or you're worried that your vessel won't hold up, because you don't have much left. And then the creature starts conjuring some weird magic spell and tells him to stop all the sad excuses and show him the shard. Otherwise he won't have any more ceremony with him. And as soon as the creature attacked the president, he realized that they had finally met, because he saw something else appear in front of him, and that ice elf fired another shot. But the president was already ready, and he reflected that spell, from which it flew aside and made a hole in the wall. But now stood not the president of the association, but the brightest shard of light, and he began to say that he had completely isolated the space because of the head of the association between dimensions. And it was not bad, but Snow Elf began to say that he was already desperate and thought that he would not find him, and he turned out to be all the time hiding in this broken vessel without being able to use his powers. They had already located the rest of the shards, and 2 of them had already been destroyed. The Snow Elf longed to see that confused look on his face, and now there was nothing more to regret, for he had decided that he would gladly destroy his vessel, to which the body of the association president began to scream at him to try. If the Ice Lord could, but the Lord thought it was a joke, and that he had decided to challenge him this way, and that, after all, he mustn't forget that his body is just a temporary shell and his true body is elsewhere. And he doesn't wonder if he can reach it. And at the same moment, the Overlord started to use his ice skills and attacked the president of the association. But the president turned out to be not bad at fighting and repelled all of his attacks. Then he started to approach the Overlord to attack him back. Their fight became so hot that it started to destroy the whole room they were in. At one point, the Overseer managed to freeze half of the association president's body, but he was able to free himself from his captivity and continue the fight. They continued to fight. But the president of the association realized that for now his body couldn't move like before, and decided that he needed to end it as soon as possible. So he hit the Snow Elf with all his might. But he had time to react and covered himself with a large block of ice, thus avoiding a direct hit. Suddenly, the president of the association kneeled down, because he realized that he was already at his limit. But the Snow Elf standing in front of him began to say that it looked like his vessel had completely worn out and he looked like a worthless shard of light. And not even a second later, the Snow Elf moved in with incredible speed, approached the association and used the ice to inflict heavy damage on the president. The Snow Elf began to speak. Just how long will it take to find a new vessel? A year or 2? By then, their army will be on the brink of war. And while my companions gather to strike back, my warriors will have completely destroyed this world. And it's my fault for choosing this way to protect the people. But suddenly the president of the association started laughing, grabbed him with one hand and said, "Do you think he would fight you for nothing? They've calculated something, but they also didn't take into account one small detail that could greatly change their plans." The Snow Elf didn't realize what that small detail was. And just as the president wanted to hit with all his might, Snow Elf dodged and the blow went through the wall. The Snow Elf began to say that it was very close and realized that it had been part of his plan all along. The president of the association replied that it was right, because he attacked the barrier that was near that building and a crack started to appear in the barrier, which eventually collapsed and there was a hole in the wall. Snow Elf didn't understand what all this effort was for to change this, but suddenly the president of the association started to say that now it was time. And today, a huge shadow ant appeared and started running towards the door in the wall and eventually made its way out. Snow Elf realized that it was a chaos dweller and just an ordinary warrior and wouldn't do anything to him. But suddenly he noticed a dark silhouette and started running after him. But at this time, the shadow soldier was already on Earth, and the Snow Elf made his way out of the darkness into the building and started running after him. And as soon as he got close, tried to destroy him. But as he swung, he saw that his big scythe was able to block someone else, a hunter named Jin Woo. And at that very moment, our hero grabbed the Snow Elf by the neck and began to ask him who it was, what kind of ice elf was in front of him. Suddenly, the ice elf saw many warriors lurking in the shadows, and he realized that the ruler of the shadows stood before him. He wondered why he had not contacted them, if he had already gathered such a huge army. But our hero looked at him and remembered that it was the same ice elf from whom he had failed to extract what our hero was always busy, and he had already forgotten about it. But the ice elf could not believe his eyes. He remembered that he was the very key link that they had missed. And at that moment the ice elf started to release very cold air from his mouth, thus freezing everything that was near him. But our hero bounced aside in time and looked at him, realizing that he had magical abilities. But that was just nothing, because at this moment, Jin Woo's amazing dagger began to appear in his hand, which he wanted to use right now. And as soon as it fully appeared, Jin Woo shattered the ice that was restraining his movement, but the ice elf bounced aside and started to say that he didn't plan to fight the Darkness Lord today. However, the hero didn't realize what he was saying. The ice elf continued talking and asked our hero that he had come already to save the man who was now upstairs. Jin Woo at first didn't understand what he was talking about, but then he remembered that he had kind of secured that ant behind his head for association. And as soon as he looked up, he saw the principal who was in a building that had a huge hole in it, and he looked closely and saw that the principal was seriously injured. The snow elf started to say to choose, for right now he was aiming right at the president of the association with the ice spear that he wanted to throw at Jin Woo. Should he save him, or should he fight him? That's the key question, the snow elf asked and released that spear. Jin Woo started to use the monarch power skill, but the opponent cancelled the skill's effect and Jin Woo shifted at that second and started to run upwards. But at that moment, he threw his blade at the nearest window to break through it and climb up quickly, and just as the spear was already reaching its target, our hero appeared just in time, being able to successfully block this ice attack by throwing it aside. And at that moment, I saw the snow elf begin to enchant the space, thus causing a portal through which he wanted to escape. But I didn't want to just give up. I started summoning daggers that were going to fly towards that ice elf. As soon as the ice elf wanted to enter the portal, a multitude of daggers began to pierce through its thick skin. At this moment, the snow elf wondered if some pitiful vessel was able to store it. It wasn't bad, but as soon as he started to leave, he said one last thing: the ice ruler would look forward to their next encounter from that man who would soon be a corpse. You can take your shadow army and consider this as my parting gift. Jin Woo thought about the fact that it seems that because of the barrier, he didn't immediately sense the signs of danger, and that was too bad. He approached the president and looking at him, he realized that neither healing potions nor anything else would help here. And at that very second he decided to call for his General Barry. And suddenly Bear appeared and heard an order from his master, to cure the president quickly, to save his life by all means. His servant began the treatment quickly, but soon after the process began, Bear turned to his king, saying he was powerless. Jin Woo decided to use the last vial of holy life, but suddenly the president's hand came up and grabbed Jin Woo's arm. He started to say that it wasn't necessary and thanked him for coming, but Jin Woo still wanted to save him, by all means, and started to tell the president to be patient for a while and that he would bring him to the hospital now. The president started to say that it was all useless, because there was no saving him after such an attack, and he was finally able to make contact with the Supreme Being. He spoke of the coming battle between the two and what they would have to do. As he continued talking, he remarked that it was good that they had Jin Woo. Who would have thought that he would be endowed with such power, and it turns out that the gates and dungeons were not for them, but for their protection. One day Jin Woo will have to make a hard choice, and he asked to stay on the side of the humans. And the last thing the chairman said was that he would like to fight shoulder to shoulder with Jin Woo and the other hunters, but his body was no longer fit for battle. However, he no longer had anything to regret because he had a whole generation of hunters as talented as Jin Woo and Bear behind him. Tens of thousands of beats had passed, and I had very little left. My heart kept beating relentlessly, as if waiting to see you. Yes, I think it was. I'm so glad I got to meet you. And thank you so much. These were the last words the president said to our hero. And shortly thereafter, his hand fell to the floor and he didn't move again. The entire barrier and ice began to crumble in that building. The next day, as an incredible thunderstorm was passing through and dark clouds were in the sky, the funeral was held. The cold days of fall were remembered with the heavy sound of torrential rains. And the breaking news on the headlines of all the media made the world known: Jonas, a Brazilian hunter, was found dead, and the head of the Korean Hunters Association died of a through wound in his chest. And Jin Woo, who returned to Korea, and Christopher Reed, the head of the Korean Gonggi Association, were not spared either. With their passing, the whole world was plunged into chaos. The international media only had time to announce the death of the greatest hunters, and even the American administration has spoken out considering the events that have occurred. Who will stand up for ordinary citizens now? After all, even hunters cannot take care of themselves, and the death of famous hunters was a heavy blow to all mankind. Our hero stood at the funeral of the president of the association and began to ask Jean Chul's assistant if he was okay. To which the latter replied and apologized to Jin Woo for his recent lack of sobriety. And that monster who killed the chairman, is it not even possible for you to defeat him? Jin Woo said. She said that when he came back, the monster had already escaped. Jean Chul couldn't believe it because the day before, he had asked him to tell him about all the events at the international conference and told him to come back soon. Jean Chul thanked our hero for being with him until the very end. To which Jin Woo replied to him that he shouldn't, because he would destroy that bastard and would definitely kill the monster who dared to take the chairman's life. Jin Woo asked him if he could summon the reporters for chaos. After the death of the head of Koganha and despite the pressurizing atmosphere in the sphere, the partners gathered for a conference and our hero started to say that a group of highly evolved monsters have targeted the top-ranked hunters. They are very powerful and act quite ruthlessly. One of the reporters started asking questions, and our hero explained that the head of the association was killed by several creatures from this group of monsters. However, Jin Woo replied that before they strike, these monsters isolate the victim with interdimensional magic. Therefore, in order to prevent hunters from falling prey to them, they should try to stay close to those who could protect them. Because then he remembers that the ice ruler said that he would look forward to their next encounter. This type called himself the Ice Ruler, just like the rulers of giants and the ruler of shadows. Clearly, no hunter could compare to them. But if suddenly there were no such people, all hunters should contact Jin Woo through the Korean Hunter Association, because the battle with the rulers would soon begin. At this time, the rulers of the other world had gathered and the dark elf who had summoned them began to tell them that the shadow ruler was now on Earth. But suddenly another ruler began to ask a question. Wasn't it said that there was no vessel that could withstand his power? And for the same reason, the dragon ruler can't be there. But the ice elf began to say that he had seen it with his own eyes and it was a greater danger than the shards of light and it needed to be disposed of. If the other rulers would help, it would be easier for him to accomplish this task. But another ruler has started to say that getting into a fight with him is not saving death on himself. He's one of the strongest kings to have lived through chaos, and why not just wait for the Dragon Lord, the monarch of destruction? But the Ice Elf explained that even though they are now fugitives, they are still rulers of war. And until when will they only wait for the Dragon King? After all, if they're going to get rid of him now, it's about time while he's still a mere human. The Snow Elf started to ask for help. He would take all the responsibility and send him into exile instead of battle. But the other rulers immediately refused. After all, they did not want to follow the example of the Demon King. To this, the third ruler called them cowards. But one of the rulers stood up for those who were called cowards and said, "Don't they know what happened to the Demon King when he was defeated? And he doesn't want to spend the rest of his life in eternal sleep, consumed by the Shadow Lord's power." But one of the rulers started saying that he couldn't make us immortal with his shadows. It seems that the Shadow Lord and the architect teamed up and were able to create copies, and he would want to avoid the prospect of becoming a plaything in his world. All the rulers started to leave, and only the man-like Snow Elf remained. He began to ask the Ice Alpha, "Is there any proof that he is still human?" To which the elf replied that he had put poison on the blade, and that was not something the Shadow Lord would do mistakenly. But suddenly some strange girl appeared and started saying, "You're right, because the Shadow Lord for possessed, his body is completely human, wouldn't use such a trick." And Icy lastly asked if they would go with him, to which he heard the answer that they would help him and kill the Shadow Lord. At this time, as the sun went below the horizon and night fell in Korea, a thunderstorm continued. There was a conversation about how he should think about who will save you when the S-level gate appears on Earth again. After all, he wants to say that even if they pay 100 times the value of the house, even thousands of times the value of the house, no one will be saved. And when Hunter Sung Jin, who fought the ants on the island, the head of the association who was watching the broadcasts with him, said that his dream had come true and now he could close his eyes without any regrets. But he didn't think it would really happen like this. Our hero stood on a tall building and reflected on the fact that the magic could still be felt. While it probably wouldn't help much, he didn't have a shadow. They are sort of called immortals, and the Giant Lord had said that rulers and monarchs are all immortals and cannot become shadow warriors. According to that logic, if they didn't have a shadow, then it meant that they couldn't be tracked so easily. But it didn't matter, because as long as he is a hunter, there is no way he would miss his prey. It had already been a week since the head of the association had been replaced and the people who had gathered in that building had begun to choose who would take the position. The position of the head was held by an awakened S rank, which was quite symbolic for the Korean association. The association that controlled the 5 major guilds had lost its backbone. So who would be able to control them now? Questioned one of those present in the audience. Another replied, suggesting that they hire another S-rank hunter. Although the top-rank hunters have a strong influence, he needs to be careful of outsiders. After much negotiation, the management members and one of the people involved suggested Jin Chul, who was standing beside them, for the position. But he didn't understand why him specifically. The man began to say that they knew he was closest to the head, so he had gotten good experience, and besides, he had enough leadership skills and the ability to call the hunters to action. And there are no laws that require a hunter of very high rank to be in the place of the head. After all, he has a lot of influence among the hunters. In other words, everyone here believes that Jin Chul, who personally caught the hunters and sent them under supervision, is suitable for the role. To which Jin Chul started to say that he lacks many qualities for this position, and there are many people who are far above his level. And isn't he too young for such a position? And on top of that, there is the position of the deputy head, the manager and the director who are gathered here today. There are many great men, but why should he be the one to sit where Kong's head sat? To this question, one of the people present began to say that he and the others on the board do not have enough power to control the great power in Korea, but he does, Mr. Jin Chul. He has connections to the major guilds, and most importantly, isn't he connected to Hunter Jinwoo? He started to reply that he had to work with him quite often, but he doesn't think that Mr. Jinwoo thinks the same way you do. Lastly, the men asked why they couldn't make him, but would he please think hard about their offer. And a little while later in the United States, Thomas Andre and his secretary were coming down in an elevator. Thomas started talking about his secretary, that he hadn't been here in a while, and as soon as the elevator opened, the guard jumped up and Thomas continued on his way. But suddenly the secretary asked him if he really wanted to give this particular gift, to which Thomas replied that she didn't think it was something that should be done in the lives of his guild members and himself. But the secretary replied that wasn't the point, and Thomas said she thought he wasn't powerful enough to use it. As soon as the door opened, they saw that there was something very strong in the far drawer, emitting powerful energy. Thomas started to say that it looked beautiful, as it always did. There were only 2 of them in the entire world who possessed such items, and that's why Thomas wants to give it away. He asked the receptionist if she felt bad that the best weapon in the world was just gathering dust here. After all, they were 2 of the greatest blades ever made. The next day, the news began to show that the Korean Hunters Association had a new chairman, Jin Chul. Jin's sister, who was reading the news, began to say that yesterday they had reported that the chairman had died. And already today, a new chairman was appointed in his place, of whom she said, such a handsome man, and the situation in the country had become very unstable. She didn't understand how the world was doing at all. Jean turned around and saw that her mom was doing the dishes. She ran up to her and gave her a big hug, to which her mom started to say that if she had nothing else to do, she could take out the trash. But Jean replied that she was too lazy to do that. Suddenly she started talking about her mom, asking if she wanted to move out of here. But her mom replied that she liked this house and that she just loved this house. When Gina started to move away, her mom asked her to get the laundry out of the washing machine, but as soon as she went into that room, she saw something strange and started running back to her mom. At this time, a lot of people couldn't believe that Thomas Andre had now appeared in the Ajin Guild. He showed up at the guild office, and as soon as he walked in, Jinho, who was sitting on a chair, couldn't believe his eyes. Why had they come to see them in the first place? After all, Thomas Andre himself had flown in straight from America, and was now sitting in their guild office. Not only that, but Leaner, the strongest hunter from Germany, is here with him. What could be worse? They've been here for 2 hours and Jinho doesn't know where his mentor is. And he's not picking up his cell phone. But Leonard, who was sitting there, couldn't imagine that Thomas himself, the Goliath of our time, had also come to see the hunter Jinho, and he wondered if he would be able to talk to him today. But suddenly the secretary began to tell Thomas that Mr. Jinwoo was now on a raid and didn't often drop by the office. But suddenly the door opened and Jinwoo walked in. Everyone in the room seemed to snap out of it and tearfully started shouting, "Our master has finally come." But Jin-woo looked at Thomas sitting in his office and began to think about what he had seen in front of the building when the crowd of partners had gathered. And he guessed that it was Thomas's pranks, even though he could sense him from a couple kilometers away. Suddenly, Jin-ho started asking why Thomas wasn't picking up the phone, to which he heard the reply that Thomas was a bit busy. And at that moment, Jin-ho noticed that his mentor's clothes were messed up. But Jin-woo started to say what happened, that there was an enemy breakthrough and Rankin bought it, and he couldn't sit idle, so challenging for their time. Plus, he needed to get his rank up right away. Suddenly, Thomas got up from his chair and started telling Jin-ho that they hadn't seen each other in a long time. But Jin-ho, who was watching this, hoped that they wouldn't start fighting right there. So Jin-ho asked him what brought him to Korea. But Thomas started to say that he must have forgotten by now, because he had promised him that they would have lunch together when his arm was fully healed. He had brought him a simply bombastic gift from America, and since Jin-woo was already excited, he was quite honored and suggested that they move to a more private place. After all, that gift better not be shown here. So, dangerous, but Jin-woo wondered, what is this dangerous item? And then he realized that he must have brought a bomb with him. Jin-woo noticed that there was another strong man in the office, and he asked him who he was. To which the man replied that his name was Leonard. Jin-woo began to ponder that he must have come for help. But suddenly Thomas stood in front of that man and started talking. Jin-woo was already thinking where they would go, but suddenly that hunter from Germany started to say that he had waited here for over 2 hours and he had the right to claim to meet Jin-woo. But Thomas still stood his ground and started to tell them to go far away. After all, this conversation is not for his ears and they should go back to their Germany. But that hunter from Germany didn't understand what the big deal was, because he had never been talked to like that before. And as soon as Thomas and Jin-woo left the office, they soon came to the nearest establishment and sat down at a table. Thomas started to say that he had no idea how long he had waited for this moment, and he waved to his subordinate who brought and placed some strange case on the table. He asked Jin-woo if he felt the power of believing here. After all, it was a thank you for sparing his guild members. Jin-woo, once he took a look, couldn't believe his eyes. Those were the teeth of the reed dragon. And Thomas was surprised, for Jin-woo could tell at a glance what they were made of. Jin-woo remembered that Reed's corpse must have been stored in the hunter's department. Thomas said that the American government wanted to create paired blades, and they decided to give away his corpse. At any rate, it would be more valuable than money. Reed's biggest sharpest tooth, which he had pulled out when it bit him, he was allowed to keep as a souvenir. It was too small for a two-handed sword, so he made daggers out of it. Who would have thought he would need them today? Lastly, Thomas said that he was giving them to him, and as soon as Jin-woo picked them up, he saw the description that they were high-quality daggers created from the sharpest dragon fang, having superior sensitivity to mana and could be amplified many times depending on the wielder's ability. His attack was increased by 1,500. Jin-woo couldn't believe that the attack could be enhanced by such an amount. He thought that a better Demon King dagger didn't exist anymore, but it wasn't even close to these blades. Considering his abilities, it was like having an atomic bomb in each hand. When Jin-woo started swinging this blade to test its speed, Thomas said that these crumbs were so powerful that even his defense paled before their power. And if he wanted to, he wouldn't be able to escape them anyway. But he hoped that he wasn't going to kill him with his own gift. However, Jin-woo realized that they were indeed different from ordinary daggers and responded to him as if welcoming him. Thomas started to ask his secretary if she still thought he made the wrong choice, to which she waved her head in denial. But Jin-woo asked Thomas why he gave it to him for free. After all, he thought that his life and the lives of his comrades were much more valuable than these trash blades. Jin-woo stood up and said that he would gladly accept them, but suddenly Thomas and Jin-woo began to feel some strange energy. Thomas also got up and started to tell Jin-woo that he too felt something, and outside at this time, a lot of people started to look up into the sky. As they were horrified at what they saw, Jin-woo realized that it was a powerful flow of magical energy that had accumulated in the sky above Seoul. Is this its true form? He wondered. Thomas, who was looking up into the sky for the first time in his life, saw how huge the gate was, and he would even say it was much larger than the one from which Reed had appeared. They realized that it looked like their world was quite. With their hands up in the air, all the people started taking pictures of this big gate on their phones and social media. Only video posts that I am now at the gate covering the sky in Seoul, South Korea. The gate you see is the largest since the first appearance of magical beasts. And as you can see, there are many citizens gathered around to witness this phenomenon, but their expressions are not the most cheerful. And that's when the doctor started talking about how he warned a few days ago about the huge political magical forces gathering in the sky and the gateway over Seoul. This was just the beginning, and we should expect other gates to appear over cities in various countries. The one who was listening to him replied to him, "What do you mean, doctor? Are you saying that this phenomenon can occur in several places?" It was this doctor who wanted to convey that everyone had studied the gates and magical animals for a very long time, and the solution would be the wisest in this situation was to pray. At the same time, our hero was flying on a dragon and approaching these large gates. He stood near them and realized that he could not pass through this gate, for it felt as if it was born of a wall. It's like it's an unusual wall and he would break it down, but given that not even an awakened person can pass through this wall, would the creatures on the other side be any different than the ones they had met before? And regardless of the events there, his friends and family are standing under that gate. Easily and suddenly, a phone call sounded to Jin-woo. It was manager Jinchul, who was currently the president of the association. He started to say that he couldn't hear him well and if he could call him back, but the problem was that the hunter was now at a high altitude, and he started to say that he should now call him chairman, to which the chairman replied, "You can call me anything you want," and he was very uncomfortable with taking a position that he didn't really deserve. And the chairman started to say did he look at the request he sent him, and Jin-woo started to say that he got and take hunter scanned all the areas by satellite. However, nowhere else in the world had the gate appeared. And did that mean that there were no new enemies anywhere except for the ones that had already appeared? It's been 3 hours since the appearance of that 3 hours that nowhere else in the world has randomly appeared. It wasn't just a coincidence, because the chairman was now planning to evacuate the civilians who lived near the gate, and in order to prevent panic, they would do it gradually. The chairman wondered what the hunter would be doing all this time, to which Jin-woo replied that he didn't even know what would happen tomorrow. A few hours later, in the Hunter Association gymnasium, our hero was practicing with BR, who was attacking him from all sides, but the hero dodged as best he could. And as soon as Bear struck again, our hero caught his arm and started to hold on to it, asking if he was sure he was giving it his best shot. To which BR abruptly took his hand back and bowed his head, saying that as king, he wouldn't dare. But Jin-woo started to say that it's okay, he just wanted to sweat a little and he knows that only he is capable of getting him to that state. But BR started to bow his head even lower and say that your words fill him with deep feelings. But our hero realized he was getting better at putting his emotions into words and asked him, didn't he eat people? But soon after that, our hero figured it out completely and was ready for battle. Bear began to attack him at an incredible speed, for he had gotten stronger with the promotion to pre-command. Our hero dodged as best he could. But, dodging, Jin-woo began to speak. Does he know that there can only be one commander behind the gate? And once Iris and Grit reach the rank of general, it won't be difficult for them to rise to commander. If he doesn't want his position to be taken, then he should continue to put his full weight on it. Because of that, he started moving even faster, attacking our hero. But it wasn't enough, and Jin-woo realized that Bear, although the best in his army, still wasn't strong enough to fight against those guys. And as soon as Jin-woo hit him even harder, he flew off into the nearest wall. BR kneeled down and started saying that he was constantly surprised by his king's strength. But Jin-woo with a smile on his face started to say what he thinks about blocking channels with historical dramas, and now, with the end of the test, well, clean up. He started to speak and called the chairman to listen to him carefully but not to get upset. After all, I have 300 insects that are doing a great job, he added. A little later, at a nearby hotel in Seoul, a receptionist started asking Thomas if he was going to leave. To which Thomas replied that how could he leave something so massive and beautiful? Anything that makes the heart swoon is beautiful, and he, the breathless dragon, the huge gate, the power of the hunter, it's all very beautiful. That's why he wants to have everything considered beautiful, Thomas said. The secretary answered him that, after all, some things he wouldn't be able to get his hands on, and here the house agreed. After all, who knew that there was a thing he could not have? She then replied that if there was no brother at home, there was no point in going back there. But Thomas didn't believe it. After all, they are all standing behind Hunter Jin-woo's back, and that means they are standing in the safest place in the universe. And besides, if they didn't stop it here, it would be even worse. And so Thomas wondered if this would be the last moment of all humanity or a new beginning. All the people started running fast out of the city to get away from this disaster that was coming at them. All the streets were jammed and there was a huge traffic jam across Seoul. But at this time, our hero's sister was with her mom in her apartment and started asking her if they were going to evacuate. To which her mom started saying that if this place was going to turn into a battlefield anyway, wouldn't it be better for them to choose the place they would die in themselves? Besides, their house is not in an evacuation zone. But her daughter started saying that she wants to go to college next year and will enjoy college life. After all, her life has just begun and she is not going to die here. To which her mother agreed, but she was sure that her son Jinwoo would protect them, just like their father. Jinwoo sat on the building and watched all of this. The atmosphere had gotten so heated, but somehow he didn't feel the presence of enemies. He wondered where they were hiding. For these enemies he must stop himself. Even if he could handle all of this, he wasn't sure he would be without casualties. After all, he still had so much to protect. He took his phone out of his pocket, started looking at his contacts and wondering who he could spend his last seconds with. Suddenly, he saw a girl's number. At this time, this girl, Hunter Cha, was practicing taekwondo in one of the taekwondo halls with her teacher, who started to tell her that he recently felt a hesitation from Ms. Cha and he is afraid that fear has appeared in her. Of course she's afraid, because he was afraid too, and he doesn't know if he can compare himself to the monsters she met. After all, back then when he lost his arm, he was very scared then. But suddenly he started to say that he seems to have been dawdling and hunters have to answer the phone. Hunter Cha apologized to her teacher, for she had to step back and take the call. As soon as she picked up the phone, she heard a familiar voice and started to tell her teacher that something had happened and she needed to go right away. But the teacher knew that she had gotten a call from the hunter Jinwoo, whom she met up with a few hours later. All the people who were on the street looked and couldn't believe their eyes that Hunter Jinwoo was walking around, and they definitely recognized him, but they didn't fully understand who was the girl next to him, and maybe they were meeting. But suddenly, one of the passers-by noticed that it was Hunter Cha from the Hunters Guild, and Jinwoo was walking with her. He started to tell her that even in this situation, there are more people here than he expected. The huntress asked him if he liked this kind of place, to which he started to reply that it wasn't that he liked it, he just wanted to come here at least once. But she wondered why he had brought her to this place he wanted to visit at least once. She replied that he was her natural friend and started to say that back then, in front of that strange statue, she said that they were friends and had come here to save the hunter Jinwoo. But she was embarrassed by those words, for she didn't think he had heard them. He replied that he had no problems. Then she asked what this strange dungeon was. To which he started to say that he would tell her when he thought about it again, as he wasn't sure what kind of dungeon it was. She turned around and heard the words of some man saying that he was a fan of theirs. When she turned her head completely around, she saw shadow soldiers surrounding them and preventing normal people from passing through. She started to tell Hunter Jinwoo that she didn't think she would attract the attention of passers-by even more with this, but he started to say that if you don't pay attention, you forget about it. Hunter Cha started to think about the fact that it's been 2 years since he became a hunter and comes out with such lightness on his heart. When was the last time something like this happened? After all, she felt different when he was around, and she could smell the fragrance again. But suddenly, Jinwoo asked her if she wanted to ride those slides that were in front of them, and she didn't mind, because she laughed so colorfully, knowing that he wanted to ride all those slides. As soon as he saw her radiant smile, he realized that apparently he wanted to visit this place. A little while later, they were riding one of the slides, but their faces were stone cold, because they weren't scared. When they got down, they went into some place where there were a lot of zombies, and ordinary people are always scared there. But they didn't care, for they had seen much scarier monsters than they had now, surrounding them. A little later, when they sat down to eat, Jinwoo asked her if she was having fun. She started to answer that she was having a lot of fun, and he asked why she hadn't screamed once. Suddenly, he realized that these slides were too slow for top-rank hunters. Suddenly, a general idea came to Jinwoo. He looked at the huntress and asked her, "Do you want to ride where it's really fun?" And a little while later, once they had eaten, they flew the shadow dragon very high above the ground. He asked her, "How's that for fun?" To which she began to answer him with a surprised face, "It's very fast, very high, and beautiful." They continued flying and she decided to ask why he took her to an amusement park when he had such a contraption. To which Jinwoo started to say something about the amusement park being built on the gate where his father disappeared, so he always wanted to visit there, just once. And the huntress said to him, "Thank you," for she wanted to say goodbye properly because he had always been generous to her. But suddenly Jinwoo began to say that he wanted to show some other place, and a little while later they were flying all over Seoul. And as night fell and the stars appeared in the sky, they were standing in some woods looking up into a mountain where there were a great many stars, and one of them fell to the ground. But at that time, where there was a huge gate in the Hunters Association of Korea, a guy was walking down the street and was thinking about the fact that in a couple of days, this gate that looked like the devil himself would open. Now he had become a hunter and had wounds. He can't just stay away, but suddenly someone bumped him with his shoulder. When he raised his head and wanted to tell that person to look where he was going, he saw a monster in the guise of a man in front of him that was much taller than him. All the hunters who were near them began to notice that there was some tension. They saw that the man's body was unbelievable, and they began to wonder, Hunter Leon, isn't there no one else in Seoul but hunters right now? The guy who was pushed started to say he was crazy. He realizes that he's going to be speeding away from here. I mean, if he hurt a man, he should apologize. This guy is the best among the hunters now, and the days of him walking away with his head down in front of his boss and being ignored by his subordinates are long gone. If he thinks it's over, if he's going to stand there like a statue and stare when a man makes a mistake, he needs to admit it and apologize. But suddenly in front of this hunter, that monster started to open his big mouth and his eyes lit up, and suddenly something terrible happened, and the hunters who were standing nearby couldn't believe their eyes. For they saw that monster eating that hunter, and that monster began to smile. At one moment there was an explosion, and all the hunters flew apart. One of the hunters flew into the nearest wall and got stuck in it. But suddenly he saw the car that threw that monster coming towards him, and their car crashed right into him. That monster started yelling for them to listen to him, those pathetic people. For now it was time to hunt them, and his teeth and claws would tear their thin skin and meat to shreds, for he was the king of beasts, the monarch of fangs. And let anyone try to stop him. But at this time our hero and the huntress were in the forest. Jin-woo began to say that he had heard that there was a good hotel nearby, and they could take a shower and have breakfast there. To this the huntress agreed. Jin-woo summoned his shadow dragon and said that they would get there in 5 minutes. The huntress didn't understand why the dragon if he said the hotel was nearby, to which Jin-woo replied that with his strength, they would get there in 5 minutes. She wondered how many kilometers it was, so they flew. While in the air, they looked at those beautiful mountains and forests. But at that moment in the Hunters Association, the president of the association began to be approached and told that right now there had been an attack right under the windows of the association. He was wondering if there were any fatalities. To which the man who was standing in front of him started to say that it was difficult to count so far because it was happening right now. The president of the association didn't understand what was going on as there was still time before the marriage was opened. The mere appearance of this dungeon alone gave him so many headaches. He wondered where this monster even came from. The president started to get up from his chair and asked where Hunter Jin-woo was now, but the man replied that he was out of contact. It was bad luck for the president of the association, but suddenly another of the wards started talking in the association's head that a hunter had appeared and started fighting this monster that was now outside, and it was said to be a world-class hunter who was nearby. But that hunter turned out to be the same guy who came to this country to see Jin-woo. And he stood in front of that horrible monster and began to wonder if he could defeat it and if his life would end right there. After all, his arrival in Seoul and the appearance of that monster. Who knows, maybe it was all fate and he was meant to fall into his hands. But suddenly this hunter heard a voice telling him to get out of the way and stay out of the way, because Thomas Andre appeared on the scene and took him by the head and moved him behind his back. But at this moment our hero was having dinner with his girlfriend, and suddenly he could still be reached. As soon as he picked up the phone, he was immediately asked why he wasn't answering the phone, to which he replied that he was out of range of the network. Suddenly, they started telling him that a monster had appeared in the center of Seoul and caused a riot, but he didn't understand how that was possible. There were still a few days left before the dungeon opened, to which the president of the association replied that it was true. Jin-woo wondered how many monsters there were, according to the preliminary count. To which he heard that there was only one monster, and now all the hunters were gathered in Seoul and preparing to suppress the monsters from the huge dungeon, and were now losing to just one, unexpectedly appearing trash. And the one guild that entered into battle with them was destroyed in a second, for it is an unusual monster. And it was reported to him that Thomas Andre had engaged in battle with it, but Jin-woo wondered about it, for he had provided them to report immediately unless he sensed something strange. But there were no signals that an entire guild had been destroyed near the target and that the target needed protection. But suddenly he realized that the signal from the soldiers who were in the salt zone was strangely something was blocking them. All the shadow soldiers that could be used to coordinate were gone, and a strong enemy, a national-level hunter who challenged him. There was a blocking of the signal. And our hero started to guess what kind of monster it was, and started to ask the head of the association if this monster had a shadow, and it should be checked, because they hide huge monsters invisible to the eyes in the shadows. And at this time Thomas stood in front of this monster and started yelling to the other hunters who were behind him to stop standing still and get people out of here. He looked at this monster and realized that the unknown beast had apparently gone completely insane. But, as his ancestors willed him, crazy animals should be punished well, and so they met Thomas Andre, a national-level hunter, and an unknown monster, which was so horrible that only with its imposing look it scared all the hunters in the area. The monster sprang into action and wanted to strike Thomas first, to which he saw that he couldn't penetrate his armor, and in response Thomas punched him in the face, causing him to start losing his balance. Thomas kept hitting him, and after a few punches, the monster started hammering him straight into the ground. Guys, the same time, one of the hunters started to get out of his car and asked the hunter who was nearby, "What stage is the evacuation of this area at right now?" To which the guy replied that so far, there were people in the building. The hunter with glasses was curious about which guild was doing this, and that guy started to say that the Reapers and White Tiger Guild had already gone there. Hunters from all over the world had been gathered from behind the giant gate, so they would soon be able to take control of the situation. But right now, they should focus on rescuing and evacuating people to deal with this situation quickly. But that hunter with glasses realized that the national-level hunter Thomas Andre was now fighting with an unknown monster. A tremendous energy possessed him, something he hadn't felt even during the raid on Jeju Island. He wondered what kind of creature it was that Thomas had to fight. But this battle didn't stop for a second, and at one moment that monster started flying from a very strong blow, demolishing with it all the buildings that were in its way. And the blow that Thomas Andre made was so powerful that the monster started to run back, but he had a frightening smile on his face and he was thrusting back. He jumped away from the building and hit Thomas with all his strength with his head right in the stomach, but Thomas managed to grab him and threw him over himself with all his might. Thomas thought he had at least noticed him, but suddenly that monster kicked Thomas in the face with all his strength. While Thomas was in the air, that monster was watching everything from below and smiling. As soon as Thomas landed on his feet, he realized that he couldn't handle him and started using his incredible strength. At this time, the White Tiger Guild finally arrived, and the head of this guild realized where the battle was taking place and started telling her wards to all get ready. But suddenly they heard a huge explosion near them, and the head of the White Tiger saw a monster in front of him, which appeared from behind his brother. He also turned his attention to the hunter who was standing nearby. It was the Goliath Thomas Andre, whom he had only heard of from stories. He knew that the Goliath was very strong and hoped that he would destroy that monster. But Thomas called them idiots and told them to hurry up and take cover. And at the same moment, the head of the White Tiger realized that that monster was unusual and he needed to transform as well. And just as he began to transform, that monster appeared in front of him, and they met gazes. The head of the White Tiger felt like a small lion in front of a big wolf, and his sixth sense was like that of animals. Desperation and unwillingness to be spread as a victim overwhelmed him, and he felt its presence. He realized he couldn't even look him in the eye. That monster started to move on, and using telekinesis he began to pick up all the cars that were in the area and throw them towards Thomas, who was standing nearby. But Thomas was able to catch the first car, and all the others immediately came crashing down on him. Suddenly, he felt himself start to be attracted. It was Thomas, who also started using telekinesis and pulling him towards him. As soon as he got close to him, he slammed his arms into him with all his might and started beating him up. He was beating him very hard, with such force that he was driving him straight into the ground. But suddenly Thomas realized that something was wrong here, for anxiety seemed to be squeezing his throat, and he didn't have the feeling that he was holding on to victory. But he kept fighting anyway, and at one point that monster grabbed his hand and started talking. How amazing that a pathetic puppet of a shard of light can have so much power, the monster said, mockingly looking at his skill. That monster also began to transform and became even bigger and scarier. When it became so, it spoke in a terrifying voice, asking if Thomas felt terror before it or despair. The head of the White Tiger and all of his underlings who were watching this battle saw that monster noticed something in the shadows and started pulling something out of the shadows. "We got a rat in here," said the monster, pulling out an ant from the wall, which was Jean Wu's ward. And that monster went on to say that he was here hiding in the shadows and only dreamed of killing his soldier with one grip. That monster switched to Thomas and started telling him that maybe it's time to be done with the games, because he seems confident in his abilities. So now it's time to get on with it. And after saying that, Thomas destroyed his armor by getting out of his grip and moved behind the monster's back. He started to say what nonsense he was talking about, and managed to make a grab around the monster, squeezing it even harder. In an instant, the monster's neck crunched, and the one who had labeled the head started to smile. But then, as if healed, his neck recovered, at which point the monster grabbed Thomas by the head, threw him with all his might against the ground, and started telling him that he was getting hungry. Suddenly, some amazing energy collided with the monster and he began to fly off to the side. He didn't realize what had happened, but once the dust settled, he saw a guy who was standing not far away. It was a top-level hunter, and that guy started saying that he couldn't let the monster do whatever it wanted. I'm this hunter who was standing there looking at that monster, realizing that even just looking at it gave me goosebumps. But at that moment Thomas Andre, who was lying behind me, began to say that I must run away or I would die. The hunter answered him that he may not remind me, because he himself understands perfectly well. But his pride does not allow him to leave so easily, because it is his choice, and he does not regret it. Even if he was destined to die here, he would still choose this end. It is better to die in battle than to be an errand boy all his life. He'd made the right choice, and he hadn't made a mistake. But suddenly, that monster started to run towards that hunter, and as soon as he got closer, the shadow dragon appeared from behind the hunter, grabbed the monster with its big teeth, and started to fly away with him. But in an instant, that monster was able to free himself from the shadow dragon's grasp and destroyed him. And once the dragon completely disappeared, that monster looked up and saw only dark energy in front of him. But suddenly our hero appeared out of that energy and kicked that monster on the head with all his might. From what that monster flew into the ground, and it hit so hard that it welded a huge hole in the ground. As soon as our hero landed on the ground, he was standing next to that hunter who had been torn apart just a little bit more. And he started to tell him that could he please move Thomas to safety. But that monster at that time, who was in the hole that he himself had made, began to say that the old man was not lying after all, and that this little man really has a shadow, and the Shadow King really comes from him. And that monster began to turn into a huge creature. But our hero was standing in front of it, and he heard a voice from the hunters who were behind him saying that they were okay. And our hero thought that lately in his life so much has been happening that he does not even have time to catch his breath. In addition, this monster is not alone here, and that monster began to tell our hero that he is interested to know how he was able to pump up to such a level. And Ice at this time also began to appear and say that, probably, the architect helped, because he is the ruler of the conclusion. But suddenly our hero noticed that behind his back also began to appear some more monster, which appeared from the ground in the form of insects and began to say or him to sit him. For she had always wanted to know what the flavor of the Shadow Lord was. And our hero watched, seeing a notification from the system that an enemy had been detected, the Lord of Cold, the Ice Lord. Also an enemy had been detected, the Lord of Beasts, the Fong Monarch. And the last one was a traveling enemy, the Lord of Insects, Monarch of Plague. Our hero stood surrounded by these terrible rulers, and in an instant a bright light appeared and began to streak into the heavens. And at that same moment, our hero uttered the keyword, appear. And immediately a darkness began to appear near his feet, which covered a large space. From this shadow, our soldiers began to appear, and they immediately pounced on their enemies. The beast ruler who saw all this was surprised to find a new shadow army. The cold ruler began to gather air around him and inhale it into himself. In an instant, he exhaled and all the shadow soldiers were frozen and couldn't move. The ruler of cold said that this was certainly impressive, but they would lack cohesion for now, for they wouldn't even be able to move in his ice prison. The ruler of the plague stood looking at the frozen insects, for this is who had taken her babies, for she had not seen them for a long time. The monarch of the cold began to say that he had dropped such a small thing on us, and it turns out to be a very ridiculous move. It seems like he thought they were weaklings. Moreover, from the looks of it, this person hadn't fully mastered the power of a Shadow Lord yet. He was the strongest among them, and one shouldn't ignore the monarch's power so recklessly. He then asked a question to our hero, and at this moment, Jinwoo looked at his hand that was frozen. In an instant, he broke the ice and began to point his incredible blade towards the cold monarch, threatening to kill him first. After these words, the monarchy began to summon its minions, the ice trolls. Also, the plague monarch began to summon his insect-like men, who rushed against our hero. He began to fight these corpses that were everywhere. At one point, a huge ice troll tried to swat everyone at once, but our hero jumped up and managed to cut off his icy leg. He then cut all the other trolls into pieces and moved towards the monarch of cold. He looked at our hero and couldn't believe that he was flying straight at him with incredible speed. A beast monarch appeared in our hero's path and began to attack him. They moved with such incredible strength that an ordinary person wouldn't be able to deal with them. At this point, the beast monarch began to tell our hero that it was so naive and did he think that some piece of metal would be able to harm him. But suddenly our hero cut off his big hand and told him that if that was the case, he really couldn't hurt him. But just a little more and our hero would have finished off the beast monarch. Suddenly, a huge toxic hand appeared and struck our hero, but he bounced aside in time. As soon as he looked up, he saw the plague monarch in the air in front of him, summoning many green hands to attack. At this moment, the beast monarch was able to heal his arm. Our hero sighed as he saw very many different monsters and 3 monarchs in front of him. At one moment, the commander of all the shadow soldiers burst out with ice paste and started shouting, "My king, I'm coming to your rescue." Commander Bear began to move towards the plague monarch and said to her, "How dare some pathetic female insect touch his king?" But the monarch of cold couldn't believe that an ordinary shadow soldier had broken his ice shackles, and didn't understand how our hero was able to create such a creature. The beast monarch began to say that the rank that endowed his warriors didn't even allow them to recognize their own mother, and began to attack the shadow soldier commander. However, Shadow Beast Commander Bear didn't want to stop and started calling the plague monarch a brainless fool. Suddenly, he flew up to our hero and said that he didn't back down even when the enemy was stronger than his master expected and his pathetic slave was so worried about him. Suddenly, zombie insects began to appear, and our hero, along with his commander, began to cut them to pieces. But suddenly the plague monarch was able to damage our hero with her green toxic hands and sent him far away, to the nearest building. And as soon as the dust settled, our hero found himself amongst the rubble of the building. As soon as he looked up, he saw a pile of ice shards coming at him. There were so many shards that their number seemed endless. But he didn't fall into despair and instantly got to his feet and began fending them off with his amazing blades that he had recently taken possession of. However, at that moment, the monarch of cold appeared, standing on a huge block of ice. He mockingly asked how much longer our hero could last. Suddenly, one of the daggers hit the cold monarch, and he couldn't understand how it happened. But when he lowered his gaze, he saw that our hero was summoning strength and summoning a hail of blades. He boldly addresses the monarch and points out that he himself is a true hero. In response, the monarch began to extract a blade from his icy body and shouted that our hero was only an insect, and how dare he speak to him. But our hero at that time was contemplating to strike the monarch in the heart, sure that this is his weak point. After finishing his pondering, our hero explodes from his seat and heads straight for the monarch of cold, standing over him. Suddenly the monarch begins to smile, for he knows that another monarch will appear behind him, attacking the hero from behind. After such a blow, our hero began to feel terrible pain and he began to bleed. Shadow Commander BR began to sense that his king was in great trouble, and as soon as he turned around, the plague monarch, who was standing over him, started saying that she was the apex mother of all chaos insects, and grabbed the shadow soldier commander, saying that he, my son, must go to her. After all, mommy wants to hug him. At this time, our hero was on Earth, and the beast monarch began to say that it was all over. But suddenly his conversation was interrupted by the commander of the shadow soldiers, Bear, who began to shout that they were miserable servants, and would be chilling for a long time to come, and immediately help our lord. Suddenly, the shadow soldiers began to destroy the ice shackle that was constricting their movements, and say that they will kill anyone who gets in their way. The beast monarch, noticing this, began to say that it seems this warrior had a high rank in his lifetime. They didn't realize that the high-ranked ones had begun to rise. However, with such a deep wound, he won't be able to fight anymore, and that's the end, the cold monarch began to say to our hero. But our hero wasn't so simple and started to rise, saying that he was the one who knew about this wound, and what the monarchs saw surprised them a lot, because they saw our hero start using the status restoration technique, and all his wounds immediately healed. In New York, all the people were watching our hero fight. In London, it was the same atmosphere, and all the people on the street were sitting and looking at their phones. It was the same in Shanghai and in Paris, they were all watching one hunter fight for the whole world. But in Korea, the hunter looked up at the sky and realized that Jinwoo was now in the middle of the storm. He wondered what was going on there, because it felt like the end of the world, and he began to wonder if this was really the Jinwoo he knew. After all, this guy had noticeably developed as a hunter, but in the chapter White silently wondered just how strong he had become in such a short period of time. But at this time, in the very epicenter of the storm, the Shadow Soldiers were fighting against monarchs and not fighting nearly on par. After all, they were all highly trained and were attacked with full force. The commanders of the Shadow Soldiers were able to cut the two arms of the Plague Monarch that was restraining him, but she at that moment began to attack him back. What she didn't know, however, was that our hero would appear at her back and tell her that during the battle with the architect, he had received an omen that the huge pillars that support this world would rise into the sky, and the inevitable death would not be his. Whether or not they could be destroyed, he didn't say. At one point our hero slashed the plague monster and it began to scream in pain, but at that time one of the hunters was sitting on one of the nearby buildings. He reflected on the fact that he had come here to deliver a decisive blow at the right moment. However, looking at the destroyed and burned city, he realized that his help would only be unnecessary. Half an hour ago, the members of the invasion team or Reapers had taken their positions in the neighboring buildings. If they gave the signal, they would start firing from the sky, and perhaps they would be able to take out at least one enemy. But then there was the question of how much strength they would have. If the plan failed, they would die, and if it was successful, they would stay here and die, as the enemy was a monster that even Thomas Andre couldn't handle. He decided that he should gradually move out, but suddenly someone grabbed his shoulder and asked him to just watch, not to move. But the hunter didn't want to stand idly by and abruptly turned around to attack. But what he saw frightened him. Many hunters who had gathered here to destroy the monsters and evacuate the civilians arrived. However, none of them were able to intervene in this battle. They could only watch and wait for the outcome, which did not seem to be long in coming. After a strong attack by our hero Monarch Plague, he began to counterattack and sent a very strong poison at our hero. But our hero wasn't so simple and turned around, saying that the poison wouldn't work on him. This made the Plague Monarch even angrier, and she wanted to attack him even more and tear him to shreds. This is when our hero used his telekinesis technique. From this force, the Plague Monarch could not dodge or even move from her seat. Suddenly, the hero jumped up and was right next to her. Then activated his Chaos Blade skill and cut her into pieces. She began to realize what death looked like, and in the darkness, even the creatures of darkness were marveled at his dazzling power. Suddenly, our hero's notification system showed that he had defeated 9 Plague Monarchs, and his level was upgraded. Not at this moment, the Cold Monarch couldn't believe how he did it. After all, he knew that our hero had not yet fully mastered the power of the Shadow Lord, and he was beginning to guess that he might have to experience that vile feeling again, an all-consuming fear of the power of one of the strongest rulers of chaos. But the Beast Monarch, who was behind him, began to say not the best things. He said that our hero, like Autumn Leaf, didn't even know how to control his own strength and that he wasn't worthy of being a true monarch. When the Beast Monarch started to squeeze the commander of the Shadow Soldiers, our hero realized that he was losing his connection to the bar and wondered if he had also destroyed the soldiers that were guarding Thomas Andre. Suddenly he wanted to cancel the conscription of the commander's soldiers, but to his surprise, canceling the conscription was impossible. At that moment, our hero ran up to his key of soldier and hit the Monarch of Beasts with all his strength, so that he flew aside. He was glad that he had managed to save his commander. Just then, the Monarch of the Cold appeared and began to claim that he was damn right he was the King of Beasts. He turned to our hero, saying that if he could hear him, he should be confident in his magical abilities and be able to control these puppets as much as he liked. He promised to capture the soldiers and make them regenerate and resurrect until they turned into fiery parasites that would devour his mana. And at that moment the Monarch of Cold struck with his trident. Our hero began to fly away, and as soon as his trident reached the ground, he thought he had finished our hero. But suddenly the Cold Monarch began to wonder where he had gone. But at that moment, our hero was already near the Monarch and started attacking him back with his daggers. But the Monarch saw him in time and managed to dodge, hitting our hero with the other end of his trident. From which our hero started to fly off to the side, and Monarch looked at our hero, realizing that he is fast and his technique to hide, and anyway, it also requires a lot of mana. He decided to end this game and run towards our hero to finish him off. They started to fight right in close. But our hero realized that movement, gaze, breathing, physical strength, movement of magic, he sees everything. And a little more, if he can get ahead of him, who can finish him off. But at this point, the Cold Monarch started to say that he doesn't know what he's up to there. But it made no sense, and suddenly the Monarch had 2 weapons, one ice scythe in his left hand, and a trident appeared in his right hand. But before the monarch of the cold had time to think back, our hero was already behind his back, ready to deliver the final blow. But suddenly our hero felt something wrong, and all the hunters who were watching could not believe their eyes. It was the monarch of beasts who was able to give a controlling blow to our hero, from which he began to bleed. And as soon as he fell to the floor, he didn't realize how this happened. After all, his level had increased and he was about to be killed, but at that moment, the cold monarch walked over and said, "Let me borrow your blade." He stabbed our hero with it and proceeded to say, "Why are you standing there? Will you please us with your miraculous healing like that time? Or are you not strong enough? What kind of warrior are you? If this is your limit, then it is a pity that you will not be able to see this world fall under the onslaught of our warriors, and the city of corpses will rise to the heavens and rivers of blood will paint the earth. Your homeland, however, will suffer a different fate." And the monarch began to promise that every inhabitant of that country would be forever frozen in the ice of endless suffering, balancing on the edge of life and death. They will never again be able to realize what is happening to them. So you must die, and let your heart burn with a fierce hatred for me, for that is the best reward for me. And as soon as the cold monarch finished speaking, he could still fight a little bit, but the player's physical strength level dropped to 0, and the player died. But suddenly, the notification system showed another function. The player had used Iron Heart, and all the conditions for the passive skill were met. Suddenly, our hero opened his eyes and found himself in a hospital bed. As he had once before, he took hold of his heart and began to remember that he had been killed by the monarchs and impaled with a sword. He began to ponder if it was a dream or not, but as soon as he looked up he saw that he was in a hospital. The ice blade had stabbed straight into his heart, but he survived. Suddenly, the guys from the Hunters Association came into the room and started asking if he had fully recovered. Our hero was surprised to see the members of the association in front of him, including Jean Cole. Jean Wu started to ask where the monarchs, that is, the monsters, were and what happened to them and how he managed to survive. But Jean Chul, who was standing in front of him, was surprised and started to say that there were 3 things he needed to know. First, he was not the head of the association, but the supreme prosecutor, and his leadership was in the investigation bureau. And secondly, he himself would like to know what happened to those animated statues. And thirdly, how would the young hunter know him? After all, don't they know each other? But Jean Wu couldn't understand what was going on. As soon as he heard about the aged statues, he seemed to understand what was going on. Jean Chul sat down on a chair and began to say that when the survivors told them what had happened, they immediately went to the scene together with the White Tiger Guild and found there. Part of the text is missing or unclear. But our hero interrupted him and began to say that it wasn't about that, and took hold of his head, beginning to think that, had he really traveled back in time? For he also thought, why does the ward look so familiar? After all, he had already been here for 2 weeks. But Jean Chul started asking our hero why he looked different in the picture. He didn't want to listen to them, because he was thinking about the fact that this ward was booked by the association, and the first place he saw after what happened in the double dungeon was the same as right now. And he didn't understand how that could happen. His appearance and characteristics hadn't changed at all, as everything he had gathered was still intact, even the Reed's fury. But as soon as he got up from his hospital bed, his sister came in and started asking his little brother what he was up to, and she hoped nothing had happened to his head. But as soon as she took a closer look at her brother, she was confused and thought she had gotten the wrong ward, and began to ask, our hero, who is he? But our hero realized that he didn't become like that right away. So she doesn't recognize him. And she didn't recognize her brother either. She came even closer and began to ask, are you really my brother? You seem to have changed something. Have you gotten taller or have you pumped up your muscles? But Jean answered her that she thought she had, and he apologized to his sister. Then he started to tell her that he had things to do and needed to go to the association right away to give up his position as a hunter. But his sister couldn't believe her ears, and our hero went on to say that he was aware that she had run away from class and so had her girlfriends. And the last thing he told her was that hating school is no reason to become a hunter. So she should push those thoughts far away, but she didn't understand how he knew her name. After all, this was the first time they were meeting. Our hero realized that he had no shadow warriors left. However, they could be reassembled. Still, he was tormented by questions. How did this happen and, most importantly, why? Why did he go back in time? And 2 years had passed. two guys who were measuring the strength of hunters started whispering amongst themselves that this guy, who was completely overlooked by Hunter Cha because of his unassuming appearance, had suddenly become an S-rank hunter. They started telling our hero that they were afraid that they wouldn't be able to measure his strength now, but he answered them that she knows and came here for another matter. After all, he has to meet the head of the association. Those guys wondered why exactly with the head of the association, and began to say that they would tell him that he was coming to him, but our hero told them that they don't have to tell him, he knows the way himself. But that guy didn't understand how he knew the location of the chapter. And a little while later our hero was going up in the elevator on the floors, and together with him in the elevator rode one of the hunters, who was thinking about what story today he would make up, and we need to find a couple of contracts. But it was dangerous to do such things behind the back of the head of the department. Our hero knew what this was. Hunter, and he went up to him and started telling him that he had the autopsy skill, but he hid this fact from the others. And a highly ranked hunter completely unable to control himself, and soon a man will come to him and ask for retribution for the abuse. And he doesn't care what happens to the criminals. However, if there's a single hunter during the mission, he'll kill him himself and he'll have to nail it on his nose to warn him. The hero wasn't going to, but that hunter was scared out of his wits and started standing there sweating and saying who the hell is he and what's wrong with this guy. It's like a ghost of some kind, and our hero continued to walk down the corridor as, just came out of the elevator, and as soon as he approached the door he knocked and began to thin. And says that nice to meet you, and he had a feeling as if we haven't seen the head of the association for ages. But the head of the association began to say that it seems that the young hunter is already aware of all the formalities since they came to me immediately after the redistribution. Rank on our hero was very happy to see the head. And thus he embarrassed him, and the head of the association began to say that he listens to the young cat who came to him, but our hero began to say that he has a business proposal for them, not that he needs to go to the island to gather his army, and he asked to remove limit on the number of hunters to clear the dungeon, and then he will be able to get rid of all the ants on the island of Chaju. But the head of the association did not understand what he said, because he knows how many raids there were conducted and how many of them ended in failure. But suddenly the head of the association took a closer look, and saw in front of him incredible power, and immediately after that he surpassed the national level hunters many times, and the head of the association didn't understand how this was possible. But suddenly, a world restart notice popped up in front of our hero, and there were only two options, either accept or reject. He began to remember those guys with whom he started and fought together against evil criminals, and remembered how he said goodbye to the girl who was about to retire, and how he fought incredible monsters that met on his way, and those orcs that were in the dungeon. He kept remembering how his mother woke up after a long sleep, and that's how he outlasted all the monsters on the island and managed to get hold of an unrealistically cool army. Soon he stopped aside, and realized he'd had enough. He started talking, knowing that it was all fake and he didn't have to try or hide anymore, for how long he was going to be hiding there. And in an instant, everything changed. Many notification windows appeared in front of our hero. Our hero asked the one who was walking towards him who he was. And it turned out that it was the King of the Dead. He began to say that if you correct all your mistakes, your one wish will lead to your remaining in this world forever, sinking into the abyss of eternal sleep. Our hero realized that he was being offered to stay in the illusion you created. But suddenly the King of the Dead said that it was not he who created this world, but it was made by your powers and your desperate desire to right all wrongs. This place is his domain, where he possesses eternal peace in death, and he has long watched a man who desperately clung to his life on the brink of death. The story of his confrontation and the trail of your resistance, a reward for your suffering and death. At the same time, his nightmare, the King of the Dead, began to say that you are him and he is you, and in his domain our hero is free to do whatever he wants. And you can tame his creatures, or absorb all power through them. It's the only place where he can deny himself nothing. The power can create, destroy, and change the world. Truly beautiful. Our hero asked the King of the Dead, "What do you mean they look alike?" But the King of the Dead began to say that he had been waiting for them to finally meet, for he is the Lord of Darkness, and the King of the Dead controls death itself. Lord of limitless darkness, our hero wondered why him. The Lord of Darkness decided to show him the beginning and the end of him. But at this point our hero was frozen after that blade strike, and the Monarch of Beasts took a closer look and started to say that it looks like he is not breathing. I'm like no, and the other hunters who were nearby started talking amongst themselves that they couldn't feel Hunter Jinwoo. Why exactly was that, since he was just here? The head of the White Tiger thought that it was impossible. After all, he was their only hope. But suddenly there was someone else on the roof of the building, and he didn't know why he had only listened to that person, and now he didn't even know if they could win, and yes, what was he even saying? They're bound to win. If national-level hunters can't stand up to these things, then who else should fight against them? And everyone got ready from now on and started attacking at the signal of that thug who was on the roof of the building. Their goal was to pursue the white monster. At this moment, the monarchs noticed that dark energy began to radiate from our hero, and his heart was once again lit up with dark flames. The monarch of cold and the monarch of beasts could not believe what they saw. So they decided that now that the brave king had fallen, they should hurry up and kill the real one. But as soon as they got close to Jinwoo, the one who suddenly appeared punched both of them in the face, causing them to start flying in the opposite direction. And that mysterious person was Jinwoo's father, who had waited for so long and still decided to intervene. And as soon as those two monsters flew away and hit the nearest wall, Jinwoo's father began to tell them that from now on no one would dare to touch that child anymore. But our hero at this time was listening to the Lord of Darkness, who said that in another world, when there was only light and darkness, an absolute being decided to separate them. From the light came the messengers of God, and from the particles of darkness came the rulers. From then on, the monarchs fed on destroying the world while the God messengers desperately opposed them, eventually leading to a series of bloody wars. Then the most prominent fragment of light, already tired of the endless battles, decided to ask the absolute being why he was not helping his loyal subjects who were fighting for him. Are you deaf to the pitiful cry of hundreds of his soldiers, and he asks that you stand out with him in strength so that they can defeat them and for the glory of their Lord? He has promised to behead anyone who gets in his way after death. The absolute being answered nothing, however, and that was the beginning of the end. The fragments of light realized that the absolute being had no intention of ending these wars at all. For him, the pain, screams, and despair of hundreds of soldiers were like music to his ears, and everyone bowed before the absolute being, shouting praises in his honor and pledging their loyalty with their lives. No one even dared to go against his will, and death awaited those who would not abide by these rules. However, the dead in this bloodbath outnumbered the living. Those who followed the rules perfectly were still dying, and there was no end to this war. Then God's messengers decided to put an end to the countless battles, and the rebellion began. The king of the dead showed that he was the one standing over there, while he was the only one who didn't like the whole thing. He was against the rebellion, but his army was destroyed and they failed in battle against God's messengers. And so it was, he thought. But as he opened his eyes in the darkness, he realized what power the absolute being had secretly transferred to him. And yes, the darkness that came straight from his black heart began to appear outside. As soon as he said, "Arise," he began to transform into the Lord of Darkness, and all the dead that lay near him also began to rise. And with a new army he headed out. When he came back, it was the end of everything. The survivors of this war, the particles of light, killed the absolute being and proclaimed themselves new gods. Now they were called rulers, and having obtained weapons that carried the power of the absolute being, they began to pursue the monarchs to end the endless battle between light and darkness. Their first victim was the king of the giants. The rulers soon imprisoned him, and the balance of power was shaken. The monarchs realized the gravity of the situation, and seizing the moment, one of them decided to lend a helping hand. They reluctantly accepted him, and so he became the 9th monarch, as well as Lord of Shadows. The fragment of light and the messenger of the god were left behind, and he began to fight against the rulers. His army grew to colossal proportions as all those who died in this war also turned into shadow soldiers. When he reached the might of a dragon lord, leading an army of destruction, the rulers and even the monarchies themselves began to fear him. 2 monarchs, more blinded by fear of his power than others, decided to give him their army as the price for such a powerful being. However, there is a downside to such power. The beast lord, the monarch lord, tucked his tail and fled the battlefield, leaving his army to fend for itself. And the demon lord, the white flame monarch, paid the price for his betrayal. And then there were rulers who began to descend from the heavens. Once they had captured the demon lord, they fell to the ground, bowed their heads, and said that it was time to end this war. They apologized to the greatest fragment of light. They had nothing more to fight for and could have easily sent him into oblivion. However, their hearts desired peace, and the king of darkness chose to do so out of respect for him. After all, he had once fought alongside them and led a large army behind him. And then he said, why is this no longer why they should fight, but who killed them, his lord, piercing him mercilessly with their spears? And the rulers answered that he was their lord. Then the plague king grabbed one of the rulers by the head and told him that that's right, this all looks even more horrible. But the rulers began to say that this decision was very hard for them. After all they wanted was to end this endless war. And the King of Darkness asked them what they were waiting for. They could kill him by stabbing him in the heart, just as they had done to the Lord. And then they would get what they were waiting for, and this war would finally declare a winner. But the rulers didn't understand what he was saying, for if his heart wasn't ready to forgive them. But the King of Darkness still wanted them to kill him. But the rulers began to tell him to temper his anger, for he is the greatest of the fragments of light. He was at a loss and didn't know what to do, so he decided to lurk in the shadows to avenge his lord's death in the future. He imprisoned the White Flame Lord in his abode forever and wanted to destroy the Fang afterward. However, as long as he regained his strength, which had lost its fighting power, the monarchy was defeated by you rulers. When he came again before those who tried to hide, increasing dragons ordered a temporary retreat so that each of them could recover their strength. And his help he accepted gratefully. So they set out to seek a world where they could raise a new army, and they came across this land. Here no one could oppose the monarchs, so the extermination of humanity was only a matter of time. A city embraced by fire. Our hero had seen something like this before, just like in the demonic castle, and he realized that their world was waiting for them. But the King of Darkness and monarchies exist to destroy, and rulers exist to create. And to be more specific, for the latter, only a world without a creature matters. As soon as the rulers realized the power of the monarchs, they immediately sent their troops to the land. However, by then the world had already come to an end, and the rulers were very angry when they learned of the actions of the Chaos Army, which they had failed to exterminate. To make things right, they decided to use a forbidden weapon that contained the remnants of the power of an absolute being, the divine instrument, the Cup of Reincarnation. This powerful weapon allowed them to turn back time, 10 years to be exact. The rulers tried with all their might to save the earth, but the inhabitants of this world were not at all prepared, and the lack of magic only aggravated the situation. The battle against the monarchs led to the destruction of the world, and the rulers realized that radical measures were needed to save everyone. So the hunters appeared people with a magical gift, able to survive the coming catastrophe in another world. The rulers did not wish them to die. Only hunters can survive in the war-torn world. However, what about those who didn't become hunters? How will they be able to live with such overwhelming news? All these are just fragments of the Shadow Lord's memory, but still it becomes clear that this world has been destroyed more than once, and no one is able to prevent this process. While the rulers are trying to correct the past mistakes, the monarchs are already developing a new plan of action, and so on in a circle until the power of the cup is not exhausted. Because this weapon has a limit, and any power is not infinite, even the absolute being. The Lord granted the hunters the power to fight and save the world from monsters. Inspired by the idea of saving people, the monarch decided to use it for her own purposes. So, while the rulers gave people the power to maintain the world, the monarchs used human bodies as a shell to destroy it. Their army has long been waiting for the right opportunity to start a battle, but the rulers are not even aware of it. The magical energy that the rulers have spread across the planet has been harvested by the monarchs in order to use it to their own advantage. However, this became a trap for the unsuspecting rulers who were counting on the help of this immense energy. A special vessel was required to control this power, but such a vessel was not found for the rulers, nor for the Dragon Lord who possessed such a powerful force. The greatest mage, who was under the command of one of the kings, decided to make a deal. He promised to help find a suitable candidate who could withstand his magic. For this he demanded to find a person with an unusual talent and high sensitivity to magic, someone with a huge reserve of power and incredible intelligence. Such a candidate was very hard to find. And then, one day, a man was found who was able to outsmart the system. Contrary to expectations, he rewrote all the rules of the game, although he was weak and his life often hung in the balance. Nevertheless, he managed to avoid death, and the Lord of Darkness watched him for a long time. Despite the architect's protests, the Dark Lord decided to choose him. The King of Darkness repeated this story of our hero, his confrontation and resistance. The reward for his suffering was interesting, and he wanted to know why the architect thought this man was unsuitable for the role. The Lord of Darkness replied that he focused on what people did best and tailored it to suit his purposes. In our hero's case, it was computer games. The Lord of Darkness raised him level by level, just like in the game, and thus, our hero built up his power with the help of his strength. And so the hero realized why the system resembled a game so much. And our hero did ask the darkness, "Why did you betray the architect?" To which she began to say that apologizing to rulers is a betrayal of monarchs. He pondered the decision. He just wants to leave it at that. The time spent with our hero was, and maybe that's why he doesn't want to lose it. He became you, and it didn't matter which one would become the master of this body, because they are one. After all, Jinwoo and the Lord of Darkness are one, and so the Lord of Darkness began to offer our hero a choice. He could just stay here and enjoy eternal sleep in the illusion he had created, where bliss and peace awaited him, or he could go to reality, or he would have to face his enemies. But our hero still wanted to clarify about his decision. Why didn't you choose the side of the rulers, and why did you decide to run away to another world with the monarchs, if there is no more hatred for the former comrades in arms in it? To which he replied, because I don't belong there. To which our hero said, behold, his answer is exactly the same, he doesn't belong there either. And the mountain asked the King of Darkness that they would never see each other again, to which the King of Darkness began to say that he would continue his rest. Well, he, the Lord of Shadows, will live forever, and so their paths are now unlikely to cross. When he dies he will fully possess his power. To come back he will need to become one with the Lord of Darkness. And at this point, our players started running the system destruction code. The system was deleted, all restrictions were removed, and the Shadow Wars with the rank of General returned one level at a time. Likewise, the Igris Soldier was restored, and the characteristics of the Radha General Bear Soldier improved greatly. The Shadow Lord began to return to the world of oblivion, and once our hero actually removed the system, a bright light began to appear. Eventually, the monarchs noticed that the fragment of light had reappeared, and the man he was trying to protect had become their enemy. If he were to be destroyed right now, this world would become a veritable hell, and he doesn't want people to be plunged into unnecessary suffering. After all, what prophet will protect the one who chose death itself? But the father of our hero did not want to retreat, even though he was told that this is the limit of idiocy. After all, how can one not understand such simple things? The beast monarch started saying that time is not on their side when I talked to him, and he should be destroyed quickly. They began to attack Jinwoo's father, who was defending him with all his might. As soon as they clashed in battle, Jinwoo's father was very good with his body and was able to read the trident's trajectory, immediately starting to move behind it. The cold monarch realized that these movements were familiar to him. Only warriors who had been through many battles acted this way. More importantly, he not only follows the trajectory of the cold spear, but also manages to dodge it. As soon as the cold monarch wanted to attack him with his icy breath, Jinwoo's father kicked him in the head, causing him to fly straight into the building that was in the middle. At this moment, the beast monarch wanted to strike, but suddenly, Jinwoo's father didn't hesitate and was able to damage the Beast King with his dagger. As a result, the Beast King bounced away and became even angrier, saying that now he was definitely finished and would quickly tear him to pieces. But suddenly, the Beast Monarch felt a terrifying aura, turned around and saw our hero start to wake up. At that moment, he jumped far away. The Monarch of Cold, who was now in the building from the impact, began to say that he wouldn't give up so easily this time and decided to fight again. But the Beast Monarch started to tell him that he had had enough and walked away, causing the Cold Monarch to get angry and yell at him that he had lost his mind, because of how he was going to roll. The Beast Monarch began to speak. "Don't you notice how much mana has gathered around me? The Shadow Lord is returning here, so I decided to leave." To this, the Cold Lord began to shout back at him that he was a pathetic coward, for he had promised to help him win. As soon as the Beast Monarch created a portal, he said that he had promised to help only if the Shadow Lord was in human form. And now the Shadow Lord himself would come to them, and he had nothing more to do here. Let him fight him if he wants to, and the Monarch left. The Cold Lord started to say that the Monarch was a dumbfounded freak, turned around and shouted for all to see his power. "Pathetic humans, all will fall before the power of the Lord of Cold," he declared, and at the same second, he began to cast a terrifying spell. The hunters standing around began to move farther away to avoid being affected by it. Everyone left their positions, and ice spears flew towards Jinwoo's father, who continued to protect his relative. The Cold Lord stood and began to speak. "How dare you attack me?" He created a huge ice shard in the sky and directed it towards our hero. The Cold Lord threatened that he would freeze everyone and took the Shadow Lord with him. However, Jin's father Wu stood firm, even though he realized that the Cold Lord wanted to destroy everything. Suddenly, an ice spear pierced Jinwoo's father's hand, and a huge block of ice was already flying towards him, but suddenly something shattered it. It was our hero's commander. And at the same moment, General Igris appeared and began to say that with such pathetic abilities he was not worthy of the title of king. But the Lord of the Cold couldn't believe that he had broken his spell and his army had returned to its previous state. He realized that the Lord of Darkness was back, but our hero started to come out of his ice confinement and said that he would be shocked too if he were in his place. Suddenly, our hero noticed that the beast had escaped again. As the Cold Lord stepped a couple steps in, our hero told him that he didn't allow him to leave. At the same moment, the Lord of Cold felt the insurmountable wall that was between them. And with it he realized the difference between our heroes and him in strength, and that wall began to grow larger and larger, so much so that from space itself the wall became visible. But eventually the whole earth was plunged into darkness. Thus our hero was able to find the King of Beasts, but then the Cold King realized that the Shadow Lord was not paying attention to him at all. And this was the perfect opportunity to kill the bastard, because there would be no second chance. The Lord of the Cold began to act and prepared to attack our hero, saying that if he thought that he was no match for him and could be ignored, it was his own fault for turning his back on him, because now he was waiting for. So the Lord of Cold decided to finish off Jinwoo with a single blow. As soon as he swung, his trident was about to reach its target. Our hero raised his hand and was able to stop his attack. His trident simply began to break and twist in different directions, and the Cold Lord couldn't understand how this happened. After all, this was the power of a Shadow Lord, the most outstanding light fragment, the king of all time. But Jinwoo would figure it out later. Right now, all he needs is the beast, and the Cold Lord will have to wait here until he returns. At the same moment, we are shown the King of Beasts, who escaped from the battlefield and found himself in some jungle. As soon as he started coming out of the teleporter, he realized that death was near and he felt the icy breath behind his back. He needed to get out of there as soon as possible. He had wasted his time arguing with the Cold Lord, and now he would have to hide here and wait for the Dragon Lord. But suddenly, the Beast Lord began to feel the power that was already near him, and suddenly he realized that he could smell the smell of death, inescapable and inevitable. He felt that overwhelming difference in power and fear permeating his entire being before the boundless power of this man. And he had to bow his head and obey, for his instincts were literally at it again, and as soon as the Beast Lord bowed his head, he began to tell the Shadow Magnifier that he was begging for mercy. The Beast King is unwilling to fight him and asks that the Shadow King forgive him and accept him as his subject. The Dragon Lord is already on his way here with his army and promises to help remove him, to which our hero replied that he agreed, but suddenly the Beast Lord started saying that he was a fake, because the real Shadow Lord would never forgive his betrayal. It was even better for him to stall until the dragon came, and then he would personally tear up the body of that little brat and chew on every bone, and that's when Jean stepped in to get him to calm down. After all, they weren't done yet and he hadn't forgiven him yet, and he began to show his 5 wounds that were done by the Beast Lord and he almost died from it. And if he could endure all 5 of his so, he would forgive him. But the King of Beasts didn't expect this turn and started to get angry, telling Jean how dare he play with him, the King of Beasts, for he should know his place, human, and by killing him, he won't gain anything by it. And as soon as our hero had a blade in his hand, he sprang into action and ran towards the Beast Lord with the speed of sound. A second later, our hero severed this Beast Lord's leg with great speed, and he began to say that there were only 4 strikes left. If he pulls through, he has forgiveness. But at the same time, the battle of the Cold Lord continued in the center of Seoul, and he saw that on one side was the ant who heals people, and on the other side was the one who won't let him even step in, the chief sycophant of the shadowy bastard Igris. His powers have returned, and now fighting him is problematic. And while the Shadow Lord is depleted of mana, they will constantly regenerate, while he has no way to regenerate the power spent on the spell. And so, as the Cold Lord ducked Igris to the ground and threw his cloak aside, Hunter Jinwoo began to emerge from him. At that same moment, the Cold Lord couldn't believe what he saw. After all, these were the 2 fangs that belonged to the Beast Lord. Jinwoo started to say that Monarch Fong was dead, but the Cold Lord couldn't believe it, because it couldn't be. He had only been gone for a few minutes and he had already managed to kill Fong. Jinwoo said that Monarch Pestilence, Monarch Fawn, and Monarch Cold, he thought that their deaths would be a perfect gift for the other monarchs. These words angered the Cold Lord, and he began to get angry. But at that moment, a blade swept over his body, followed by a second blade. But the Lord of Cold did not want to just give up, and he began to use his magic. Suddenly, our hero took the blade behind his head in his hand and used his other hand to slash the Cold Lord, starting to say that the beast died on the 4th attack. He wondered how long the Cold Lord would hold out, and in an instant the Cold Lord died and began to vaporize. And as soon as his remains were gone, our hero decided to find the man who had been protecting him all this time, and Ant Bear started to say that he had suddenly disappeared. But suddenly our hero saw a blade that was lying on the ground, and he realized that it was the same man, his father, who was nearby and bleeding, because he was badly wounded. He was lying near the wall and realized that this was the price of possessing divine power, and he didn't mind that he was about to die. But suddenly his blade flew to his feet. And as soon as he raised his head, he saw his son, who began to tell him that he seriously thought he wouldn't understand anything, because how long was he going to go on like that, father? Jinwoo's father began to tell him that there was a gateway portal connecting the world of humans with the world of chaos, where demonic monsters dwell. According to the well-known rule, after defeating the boss, the hunter must leave the dungeon within an hour. However, he was too late, and a ruler appeared out of nowhere, offering him his power. He had to kill all the monarchs, including the Shadow Lord, who was to be reborn in this world. In his heart there was hope for salvation long ago, and he agreed to the deal, returning to Earth as a god's messenger who was to fulfill the will of the rulers. However, he failed to fulfill their request. When he saw that mankind's worst nightmare was living in his son's body, he gave up and watched from the sidelines. Meanwhile, the rulers who had been trying to prevent the Shadow Lord from appearing until then gradually began to change their minds. In the end, the brightest shard of light gave him a new order to protect the Shadow Lord. The rulers finally realized that they needed a Shadow Lord, and no one but him could stop the Dragon Emperor and his army of destruction from arriving on this world before the heavenly soldiers. They were risking everything, for no one knew who to choose, the Shadow Lord, the humans, or the monarchs. And the answer did not take long to come. And so he helped his son, but he did not want him to see him like this. But our hero only said the word daddy. His father asked if he hated him all this time, to which our hero replied that yes, but sometimes, and as his father began to apologize, our hero said that when his life was constantly hanging in the balance, when he had to go out of his way just to see his mother and sister, his image always popped up in his mind, and he hated him for it, but missed him terribly. And after this conversation our hero asked his dad if he missed him, and tears came to his dad and he started wiping them away and saying that he always missed him. Even when he didn't see him, he was happy to watch him, at least from afar. And at that very moment, our hero's father stood up and hugged his son and started saying that he was proud of him, because his son had grown so much and had become a great boy. But our hero also began to cry, because he was so happy to see his father. But at the same moment he hated the rulers, for he thought it was their mischief. They first use it, and now they throw it away for lack of use. But his father began to say that the rulers had nothing to do with it, they only gave him a choice, and he decided to protect it, though he did not regret it one bit. And now he would like to talk longer with his son, at least a little more. He wants to be with him, as now, and the last words that the father began to say, found the hero, told him to forgive him, because he is sorry that he could not be a good father to him. And at the same moment the father found the hero dissolved with a bright light. But at the same time our hero's mom looked out the window and saw the destroyed city. Her daughter, also our hero's sister, sat frightened. At some point, the mom started telling her daughter that she was ready to leave this place. It seemed to her that the hour had come. At the same time, our hero, who was standing near the destroyed buildings, began to shout into the sky so that the monarchs would hear him. For he promises that they will all pay for their atrocities. On the day that the Shadow Lord's desperate cry deafened the world and the curtain of imminent war rose, a quadricopter that flew over the ruined city was transmitting a message that Thomas Andre was okay. His life was not in danger. Ambulances passed underneath them, taking the wounded to hospitals, and all the monsters were destroyed. Now only ashes were left of them. Soon our hero was able to come home and hug his family. Those hunters who sat near the destroyed building were very tired, because they fought with all their might. The head of the association sat in front of a large monitor and realized that it was finally the end, for the demonic beast and the plague woman had finally been destroyed. The head of the association recalled the words of our hero, who said that he would destroy this bastard, actually wipe the monster into powder, to dare to take the life of the chairman. And the head realized that this monster was a cold elf. He was very grateful to the hunter Jinwoo for keeping her words. I got my revenge, and soon the Hunter Bureau reported that they had failed to identify the monsters that had attacked the city, and the extent of the damage had surpassed all limits. However, the real nightmare would come a few days later when the hunters, looking up into the sky, saw a huge gate that was above them. Some of the hunters looking up into the sky realized that if they looked at it like that, it would suck in all the hunters gathered here, and Thomas Andre, who was watching, that it would soon begin. For never before in the history of mankind had so many hunters from all over the world gathered in a battle against a common enemy. And just how many hunters would they need to prevent this calamity? The huntress standing next to our hero began to tell him that she thought it was the first time she had seen him so worried. All because the gate was about to open. All those hunters who were looking up into the sky realized that things were about to start, and they all began to make preparations for battle. They saw a huge army in front of them, and it was not just huge, but gigantic. But suddenly our hero began to look closely, and suddenly he saw shadow soldiers, who one by one began to come out of those huge gates, and behind them came huge dragons, reaching for the infantry. The hunters who were watching this from the ground began to prepare for battle, and suddenly our hero began to tell no one to move, and none of the hunters understood why they were not allowed to attack. The head of the Hunters Association asked our hero why he stopped everyone, to which Jinwoo began to say not to worry, because everything is fine. And no one understood why everything was fine. After all, there was already a terrifying army of monsters in front of them, and the hunter who was standing not far away was wondering how they were going to attack them from here. But suddenly our hero began to go at them alone and stood in front of the leader, who had already descended closer to the earth. As soon as they got close, that huge shadow soldier stood in front of our hero and began to lower himself little by little, and eventually knelt down and began to speak. He said that Commander-in-Chief Million Barayan and his entire shadow army welcomed their lord and the chairman of the Hunter Association. Our hero could not understand why they bowed and what they were talking about, for he did not understand what was going on here. Thomas Andre, who was standing not far away, began to tell his comrade that he also sees that there are 3 shadow monsters gathered here at once, which alone can destroy the entire humanity. Our hero, looking at all this army, realized that this is a parting gift from Osborne, the previous Shadow Lord. For the moment, our hero was satisfied. After all, everything was now ready for the great battle to begin. And a few days later, the Korean Hunter Association began to negotiate that the foreign media is demanding clarification on the situation, and the American Hunter Management Office is requesting information on the whereabouts of Hunter Jinwoo. The DHS wants further instructions on how to evacuate citizens, and the producers of a popular TV program about hunters invited Jinwoo for an interview. One of the men present began to say, after all, he was not happy that again this Jinwoo with his shadows that came out straight perverted. But the chairman of the association replied to him that he would rather have monsters popping out of there, and it was sinful for him to complain now. He'd rather get calls from all sorts of TV studios asking him to invite Hunter Jinwoo on a talk show than endless moans from relatives who are desperate to find dead hunters. The chairman began to reflect that they could be understood. After all, he himself was surprised by this turn of events, and he didn't think that over 100,000 monsters would turn out to be Jinwoo warriors. He began to tell everyone around the table that he was sure they were very surprised by the sudden disappearance of Hunter Jinwoo, but it had happened many times before, and it was time to get used to it. After all, who else but them would be able to support him in such a difficult hour? One of the men who sat closest to the chairman started to say that he was right and apologized for it. He was too biased in his opinion of Hunter Jinwoo, and as the chairman sighed, he wondered what Jinwoo was doing now. He was very far along in this line when he started to meet his shadow soldiers and his vast army. The Baron-in-Chief started telling him that he wanted to divide the army and send some of the warriors away. He had never thought of that. To which our hero began to say that's right, they at best won't die while he provides for them with his mom. And at the same moment Commander Bear began to approach. Commander Bear approached his king and asked if he could have the title of Commander-in-Chief. Our hero wondered why he suddenly decided to become Commander-in-Chief, to which Bear replied that as a general he wanted to test his strength with the Commander-in-Chief, the Baron, and fight him. Our hero did not object, and they stood opposite each other. Commander BR began to roar furiously, and the Baron, the Commander-in-Chief, drew his huge sword and used it just like Igris. Although compared to him, the Baron's sword was much larger and he appeared to rely more on strength than speed. As soon as Commander BR rushed towards him to attack, Commander-in-Chief Baron started using his huge sword that was splitting apart. Our hero was surprised at the way he used his sword, for he was doing it just like Igris. However, compared to him, the size of the Baron's sword seemed simply enormous. At one moment the Commander-in-Chief was able to grab his opponent with his huge sword, which restrained his movements, and with great force he threw him to the ground. Our hero, who was watching this, couldn't realize if they were done, because everything happened very quickly. However, he didn't expect the Baryon to instantly block BR's attack, and it turns out he has good reflexes. And what to speak of strength, he has no equal, and no wonder he has the title of Commander-in-Chief. However, with insects you should be careful, because their main feature is survivability. And at one point, BR was able to get out of the shackles of that ball and attack Baryon in return. At this time in Beijing, at the international airport, one of the hunters whose name was Jigan was walking around. And one of the reporters ran up to him and started to say, what a proud moment for their country, that all the hunters returned home safely after the rescue mission in South Korea. And while some continue to praise the bravery of the hunter, more and more there are people who are not happy with this decision. What does the hunter have to say about it? The hunter in Jigan, without thinking for a long time, began to say that it was bullshit and started asking the reporter, what's the purpose of having a head to wear a hat? Do they even have a map of the world open? If you look closely, it doesn't just show South Korea, and it's amazing that people like that still exist. But anyway, he has something to say to them. After all, he's the 7-star hunter. Jigan went to South Korea to help Hunter Jean deal with something that even he can't handle. But if even that answer doesn't satisfy them, they can go and catch those monsters themselves. But suddenly their conversation was interrupted when the hunter raised his head to the sky and couldn't believe it because of what he saw there. There was a huge gate, and at that time on the other side was a brother mysterious monster. He approached the other and began to say that the Shadow Lord had turned them away, and he would deal with him, but the others, for now, should do nothing. After all, they cannot lose any more comrades, and his warriors must prepare for war. But at the same time, the fight between the shadows and the soldiers continued, and Commander Bear was crushed and lying on the ground. Near his head, the sound of the Baron's sword sounded, thus making it clear that he could not be defeated. And as soon as the fight was over, Commander BR started telling Jinwoo that he could still fight. Our hero wondered why he was so eager to become Commander-in-Chief. To which Bear began to say that he wished to stand on the right side of his king. However, Jinwoo countered that it was not at all necessary to become Commander-in-Chief and he could stand on the left side. Immediately after that, BR got excited and started saying that his king was so generous. At the same second, one of the shadow soldiers also started saying that he wanted to fight. But our hero didn't want to listen to that.